人は何かの犠牲なしに何も得ることはできない。何かを得るためには同等の代価は必要になる。それが錬金術における等価交換の原則だ。その頃僕らはそれは世界の真実だと信じていた。
Japanimation Station。
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, our first proper topic for Japanimation Station, we are talking about the adaptations of the hit manga Fullmetal Alchemist, also called Hagane no Renkin Jutsushi, or Hagaren in Japan. And so that's what our first full topic is going to be. And today's episode is about the first animated adaptation from 2003 to 2004, directed by Seiji Mizushima, which is the original Fullmetal Alchemist adaptation, which only adapts the first 7 or so volumes of the manga and then goes off to be its own anime original thing. And we have very different relationships with this anime.
We do, and I think that's probably where we want to start today, right, Sean?
Yeah.
So I'll just say Fullmetal Alchemist is one of my oldest manga and anime loves. As Sean said, the original anime adaptation aired in 2003. The manga had been running for a very short time at that point, which is something to talk about later. It was kind of an insane decision to adapt it at the point they adapted it, because not only had it not been running that long, but Fullmetal Alchemist was a monthly manga. It was not a weekly one, so new content only came out. You couldn't have done the thing that like One Piece does and keep going every single week because there's a new manga chapter every week also. That's not how Fullmetal Alchemist worked. It published in Monthly Shonen Gangen, I think, which is the Square Enix magazine.
Yes.
So, you know, it came out at that point. It came over to the United States starting in 2004, and the DVDs were 2005 and 6, which is when I started seeing it. And Fullmetal Alchemist, like I said, one of my first loves. I had been into, as we talked about last week, some of the big anime that were on TV, like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball. But Fullmetal Alchemist, for me, was the first anime I fell in love with that I would call a more limited anime. That was not like hundreds of episodes, that was not a big kind of ongoing concern, that was a sort of direct and limited story, and also aimed at an older audience. Like Fullmetal Alchemist, the 2003 anime, I think one of the interesting things about it is already pitched at an older audience than I think the manga is in a lot of ways. Like the manga and then Brotherhood is more recognizably shonen, and the 03 anime gets extremely dark by the end, and has some heavy violence and stuff through it. So it was pitched to a different audience when it came out in the States. It was one of the first Adult Swim anime when it aired on Cartoon Network. And basically, my brother and I do not remember how exactly we got into it, but we did, and I just remember the summer or the year or whatever it was where my brother and I saved up all our allowance to, every time we could, buy another volume of the anime on DVD. And that's how we watched it. And I have, because I watched it for this episode, my original 13 volumes of Funimation's Fullmetal Alchemist DVD. And just looking at those volumes is actually a good way to understand how Fullmetal Alchemist was pitched in the States when it came out. Because those are like very deluxe, nice DVDs with like clear cases and all this art. And they all came with like a 50-page booklet that had like art and like translations from the Japanese volumes. And, you know, obviously you had the Japanese audio and the English dub. The English dub doesn't 100% hold up today, but like, given Funimation's other efforts at the time, was clearly an effort to be more adult and mature with how they did it. It was a very serious, faithful adaptation that did a lot of interesting things. And so honestly, I would say this show was almost pitched more in the legacy of like Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, those kind of shorter shows that sort of were a little older skewing and left a certain kind of imprint on people of like, oh, anime can be this like broad art that can kind of tackle any kind of subject matter. That is not necessarily Fullmetal Alchemist like legacy in Japan, where it's much more of a continuum. But that's kind of how it landed here, and it was a huge work for me. You know, I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I also realized watching it, just like it imprinted on me a lot of things about sort of storytelling and not just in anime, but in general, and then a lot of anime things as well. I love it. And I later... We did not have the manga right away when the anime was coming out. It eventually Viz got it and started putting out the volumes, I think after the anime had finished airing on Cartoon Network. So we didn't even know it was different than the manga. And I remember eventually getting into the manga and getting to the point where like you're meeting characters from a, you know, alternate version of China, and I'm like, that wasn't in the show. And that's the tip of the iceberg. And so I've read, I actually don't know the last time I would have like actually read the manga all the way through, Sean, but I know, like, I remember reading up to like, the part in the manga where like Ed is swallowed by gluttony and all of that stuff. That was before Brotherhood aired, and being like, this is really different. And then of course when Brotherhood aired, which is a funny historical thing we're going to have to talk about when Brotherhood comes out, because Brotherhood aired, I'm pretty sure, the exact same season, not just year, as Dragon Ball Kai, and so it was this weird confluence of shows redoing old anime, and eventually obviously got very into Brotherhood, and loved that. And I definitely saw Brotherhood before I'd finished the manga. I mean, Brotherhood started airing before the manga was over. They finished very close to each other. But anyway, that's my backstory with it. And so Fullmetal Alchemist has just been a constant in my life. Like, I also have my DVD of the movie Conqueror of Shambhala, which we're going to talk about next week. And I found a movie ticket for the night that Fathom Events played it in theaters, and I vividly remember seeing it on the big screen because it was one of the first anime movies I got to go see in a theater that wasn't like a Studio Ghibli thing, you know? So anyway, Fullmetal Alchemist, always been a huge part of my life. I have some of the Viz volumes of the Full Metal edition, which is the very nice like hardcover color versions of the manga, sitting over on my bedstand. Always been one of my favorites, but I have not seen in its entirety the 2003 anime in a very long time. And God, I don't know where we're both going to come down on it, Sean, but I think we can both come down on it's going to be really fucking interesting to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And you know, for me, I have a much simpler relationship with Fullmetal Alchemist in that I almost didn't watch it at all. Like, I definitely saw a few episodes when it was on Adult Swim. Like, I remember seeing the Show Tucker, Nina Tucker stuff. The thing I most honestly actually distinctly remember, because I think this is why I had for a long time kind of like a understanding of what Fullmetal Alchemist was, is I remember seeing the episode where Ed fights the armor, like the samurai brothers who are both transmuted into the suit of armor. And so I always in my head was like, oh, it's like a Yu Yu Hakusho, Dragon Ball, Naruto. It's like a battle show. And it's not. Like, the manga is more battle-focused, but even that's not battle-focused the way a Yu Yu Hakusho or Naruto.
And only in its second half, really, not in the first half, yeah.
Yeah, but, like, that fight with the armor guy is so much one of those kinds of fight scenes. It feels like an early Yu Yu Hakusho thing where it's like, oh yeah, because it's really early, the fight's just one episode. But later on, it'll be like 20 episodes is like what a one fight scene kind of thing, and it escalates. And so for years, that's what I thought Fullmetal Alchemist was, because I remembered watching that episode. And when I eventually read the manga, I got to that part and was like, oh yeah, I remember this. This is the reason why I never really actually knew what Fullmetal Alchemist actually was, which is more of a sort of dark fantasy steampunk thing, less of a battle thing. But yeah, so like I had a little bit of a history of Fullmetal Alchemist, just seeing it in bits and pieces when it was on Adult Swim. But if people remember from last episode, this started coming out around the time that I started moving away from anime and started watching more like American TV and stuff like that. Because this would have been, it started airing in November 2004. So it started airing over here a year after it finished, basically in Japan, or like a year after it started in Japan, more or less. And so that was around the time we were starting to get into middle school. So again, it was like part of that phase of me kind of moving a bit away from anime stuff. But I did remember it well enough that when I got to the second core of this watch through and the Larkin Seal song played, I was like, I remember this song. Holy shit. Because that was the song that was basically the song that was the used. From what I understand, Rewrite was used at the very end, the Asian Kung Fu Generation song, but the first three cores that aired over here just used the Larkin Seal song. And so I remembered that. So I have a vague sort of relationship with Fullmetal Alchemist from when it aired, but almost nothing. And then I did watch the first 2 episodes of Brotherhood a few years ago at this point. I think it was around the time I started student teaching, which was a bad time to start trying to watch something because I just didn't have time to watch anything. So I watched the first 2 episodes being like, tomorrow I'll watch episode 3. And then the next day came and I was like, I'm too busy to watch or do anything. And then the day came after that, and I continued to be too busy until it was like a couple weeks later. I was like, well, if I'm going to watch episode 3, I'd have to rewatch the first 2 episodes. And I think that's when I just decided to start watching Gundam again, because that was like, oh, I can just watch Gundam, and it's whatever, because I've seen it before, and it's kind of comfort food in a way, rather than trying to watch a new show. So I've seen the first 2 episodes of Brotherhood. And I will be able to finally see what happens in episode 3 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. I think it's just the first chapter of the manga, but I'll find out soon, and that's exciting. But then the big thing is, a few months ago, I read through the manga in Japanese because, I was too annoyed at the, what do you do? Do you just watch through Brotherhood? Do I go back and watch that? Do I just decide to watch the original anime that is different from the manga? And everyone has different opinions on how you watch it. And I just said, fuck it. I'm just going to read the manga, which would be my recommendation to people. Because it's just easy. You just sit down and read the manga, and it's great. And you don't have to worry about any, adaptational things, or it's like, oh, does it move through this section too quickly? Oh, does it change too much stuff? It's like, no, it is just what it is. The manga's fantastic. I don't think it's not, my favoriteest manga of all time. I don't think Fullmetal Alchemist is a thing that, hits me in, a deeply personal way. But it is great. I respect it a lot. I think the manga is incredibly well made. It being a monthly publication means that the art is given a lot of room to be refined. So it just feels like Arakawa sensei, the mangaka, has a lot of space to just sort of really dial in on a lot of the key moments. And so the panel construction and the art and all of that is fantastic. The characters are amazing. It's got such a fun sense of tone and humanity to it. So it's a fantastic manga series that I have a couple of criticisms of that I imagine we'll be able to get into in Brotherhood when it covers similar material. But that was my background for it. So I know that a lot of people, because I've seen them on Twitter, listening to this podcast, come from it the Jonathan direction, which is the normal direction people come to Fullmetal Alchemist in America, is watched it when they were younger on Adult Swim or bought the DVDs, then kind of follow, and then had a revelatory moment when they realized, wait, what do you mean that this is different than the manga? Which I remember being on the outside, because I knew, including you, several people who were into Fullmetal Alchemist, and all of them at some point had this realization of, what? Do you mean this isn't what you mean? It's different? Because there was just no understanding of that over here because the manga wasn't out.
Yeah, can I tell you, for the longest time, I had heard a chatter on the internet that the villain in the manga was named Father, and so I, for the longest time, Sean, thought that Hohenheim was the bad guy of the manga because he's their father. And no, there is a relationship between Father and Hohenheim, but Father is not related to the Elrics. It's rather confusing if you don't actually read the manga and know what they're talking about. So I remember still in the back of my head somewhere, I something about Hohenheim. I'm like, he's the bad guy, and he is not in any version of it. But it's very funny to me.
Yes. So most people have that kind of experience with Fullmetal Alchemist. Whereas for me, the framework I had coming into this very much was I had just read the manga. So it's it was kind of impossible not to watch the show through that framework and see it through that lens. And I found the experience fascinating because I think just the way this show has been described to me, the 2003 adaptation, for years feels totally off base from, I think, the show that I watched in ways that I think are, it's just because naturally, because I have this different framework, I'm also much older right? So it's like I'm not 12, 13 years old watching it. I'm a 29-year-old man who probably shouldn't be spending so much time watching kids' cartoons, but I fucking love them. So it's like,
Well,
you know,
and we should say, like, it's a different experience than anyone, when the show was made, could have had, because the manga wasn't done. The manga wasn't even halfway done. So you're coming at it in a very new, like, honestly, a direction that I don't know anyone else who's come at it from that way. Of the manga was finished, they read it, and then I've seen some people maybe watch Brotherhood and go back, but this is still different even than that. So I guess, I mean, people know I love this show, and rewatching it, it's got a lot of issues, and like, Jesus Christ, the mind is boggled by that this show is even halfway coherent, given the task that was set of, like, take 6 volumes of this completely unfinished thing and make a finished show out of it. It's a crazy ambitious thing. I still love it. Sean, what did you make of it? I'm so curious. I don't know.
I'm very mixed on the thing as a whole. Like, there's stuff about it I like, and there's stuff about it I don't. I think, like, for me, what's interesting about it is it kind of feels like it's 4 different TV shows stuck together, almost precisely around the 4 different cours, which we should probably go, like, for people who don't know, like, just in case people don't know that vocab, cour, when we're talking about an anime show, that's COUR, it's a French term, and that's just, like, 12 to 13 episode chunks, which is how TV is organized in Japan. So, like, when the opening themes and ending themes switch over in a show, that's usually when the core change happens, though they do delay it here for Fullmetal Alchemist for the last one, because they want to change up the opening narration, and so they wait until it becomes an appropriate narrative moment to do that. But that's kind of like the way that TV is produced in Japan, and the production side, what they look at is 12 to 13 episode chunks usually, and so that's why shows are organized. And they're either like, oh, this is a 12 to 13 episode show, this is a 24 to 26. Sometimes you'll get a 3-cour show that's like 36 or 38 episodes long. This is a 4-cour show, so it's a whole year. It's 51 episodes. Interestingly enough, Brotherhood, when we get to that, is a very rare 5-cour show. It's like 62 or 63 episodes.
64.
So, yeah, 64. So it's a 5-cour show. So that's how, like, Japanese TV typically breaks down. And I feel like the 4 cours of this show are kind of 4 different TV shows. All 4 of them have very different approaches to the manga. Obviously, with the 4th cour being, like, totally its own thing and is completely off of the manga. But the 4th cour is the only part of the show that's completely off the manga.
That's true.
It's not the second half. It is the last 12 to 13 episodes is the only part where it is detached from the manga entirely. Which is very different from, like, what I had understood about it based on the way that people talk about it. And yeah, so, like, I think for me, the 2nd cour of the show is fucking A+, amazing. Like, and really it's like episode 3, even though that's part of the 1st cour, is where I started to kind of, like, feel like, oh, this show's actually really good. And that 2nd cour, like episode 13 to 25 or so I think is really strong. I think the 4th cour is very interesting, if extremely messy, but it gets to be its own thing. And then cour 3 and cour 1, cour 1 I really don't like. Cour 3 I think is weird because it feels like they have just mashed together very faithful manga episodes and totally original anime episodes, and they, like, smash together in very awkward ways. And so that's kind of my feeling on the show, is I think it has a lot of really interesting elements, and stretches of it are really great, but it is incredibly fractured in the way it's presented, which I think makes sense because, like you, Jonathan, I think it is a miracle that this show exists in this state at all. It is, I think, it is probably the most, I would have to, like, really sit down and think about it, but off the top of my head, it's the most successful anime only kind of version of a manga thing I've seen. Usually this stuff is a lot more awkward than this, and so I think it is very successful in what it has to do, even though, like, what it has to do is very, very hard. But coming at it from the perspective of having read the manga and enjoyed the manga quite a bit, like, I think where the failings of the show feel like a lot more kind of stark to me than probably you would see it if you didn't have that background. And it made some of the viewing experience fairly frustrating, particularly in that first set of 12 episodes.
That's really interesting, and I'm actually really excited to talk to you about that 1st cour, because I don't have those issues, but, well, what I expect are your issues, but I'm very curious to talk to you about them, because that's just how it was presented to me originally, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it doesn't have, it is imperfect, and I would broadly agree with you that the 2nd cour both has just one, an amazing set of opening and endings, and then also I think is probably the best stretch of the show creatively, although I do like the fourth cour quite a bit. It goes for something. And I want to stress a point you just made about like this being a kind of wildly successful compared to a lot of other things version of an anime only story based on a manga, because this is the most visible one to Westerners, to people who speak English. I often see this being used, like when Game of Thrones was finishing and it did its anime-only ending to the books, and it was a fucking trash fire. People would say, oh, this reminds me of Fullmetal Alchemist. Maybe one day they'll do Game of Thrones Brotherhood. And that is such a wild insult to Fullmetal Alchemist 03, because whatever problems it has, it's trying in a way that Game of Thrones at the end did not, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this show had to have 50 to 52 episodes. Like, it was not a thing where, like, Game of Thrones could have kept going for as long as they wanted. They just said, yeah, fuck it, let's just stop it. Like, it's a fundamentally different project. Like, they had to look at this thing, which is a much, like, this limited snapshot of a much bigger story that was not done, and try to figure out how do we take this and fit it into specifically a 50 to 52 episode shaped TV whole, and what the fuck do we do with that? Which is very different than, like, we've got infinite money. We're the most popular TV show in the fucking world. We could keep doing this, and they would let us make 12 seasons of this TV show, and the studio would be thrilled. Let's just do 2 more and then pull the plug. It's a very different scenario than Game of Thrones.
And a different scenario than a lot of other anime. This is not the Garlic Jr. arc from Dragon Ball Z. This is not Dragon Ball GT. This is not your, 70 episodes of Naruto filler or whatever. This is not, shit, we have time to fill, let's just see what we can do. This is, a very measured and, full-throated, wholehearted attempt to tell a story out of the pieces they had and spin it in, whatever else you think of it, whether you think it's successful or not. There is so much thought and artistry going into what themes are we tackling, what do we view these characters as. It has a point of view on everything. And that does not mean it is perfect. That does not mean it is always great. That does not mean you can't dislike it. All of those are valid reactions. What I don't like, and I think these have become a prevalent take in the years since Brotherhood, is the dismissal of this one as a pure oddity that was just a cash grab or something, and you would compare it to the end of Game of Thrones or something. And I think that is wrong. I think there's a lot more that this show offers. I don't think it's better than the manga. I don't think it's better than Brotherhood. I'm not going to say any of those things. I do like it and think it is valid and has interesting things to offer. And I still value it a lot as a show. And I think all of those things can be held true at the same time. And I do sometimes see in the race to be well, there can only be one true Fullmetal Alchemist, right? And that's a reductive way of viewing it. It's okay if there's this one too, and I think it's really interesting to watch and talk about. I think it's also a fascinating early to mid 2000s political thing in the same, not to the same degree of Gundam 00, which Seiji Mizushima directed after this, and is a much more cogent and coherent political critique. But you can see that the events of 9/11 and the war in Iraq and the increasing American imperialism is 100% on the mind of this show, and really fascinating to watch. And if you were a kid in America in the mid-2000s, this might have been one of your first significant experiences with a full-throated anti-war work that has something to say about racial disparities and imperialism. And I think all of that's just very interesting and worth talking about.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, because I'm sure I don't like the show as much as you do, but I do think that it is it's worthwhile. It's an interesting show in its own right. And I think especially if you don't have a framework that creates preconceived notions, there was no way I could put the manga out of my head and watching that show. It's just not possible. If you don't have those preconceived notions, I think you're going to like the show more, because the sort of incision points that they're using to sort of structure the show and kind of tie it all together is going to be a lot harder for you to see, whereas it's fairly obvious if you read the manga recently. But the show is it's not a thing that should just be dismissed, I guess. And I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. And I guess I'll put my cards on the table too. When you say recently, you read the manga extremely recently, this year, right?
Yeah, so, it was 2 months ago, yeah.
So it's very fresh in your mind. I have not read the manga or watched Brotherhood in many years. So there were some things in this where I was watching and I'm I have to look this up. Like, did this happen here? What is I will tell you, the part that threw me for a loop is in Core 3 with the greed stuff, and I'm like, I remember this, but this is so different. And it's because that is the most out of context adapting they do. So that one, like, threw me for a loop. The whole thing of, spoilers for the whole show and Brotherhood, just for those wondering, when King Bradley kills Martell inside of Alphonse, I remembered that from this show, and I was saying to my brother, man, that's a powerful moment. And he's like, that's in the manga and Brotherhood too. And I'm like, is it? And he had to remind me, and then I had to go look it up. I'm like, oh my god, it so scrambled my brain because I had not read it recently. And that is a little bit of the experience of this show. If you have like the vague memories, some of it is just fucking surreal.
Yeah, because the Martell's death is the last thing they pull from the manga. That's from the chapter 1 to volume 8. Yeah, that's like the latest thing. They just pull that scene kind of out of its context. But yeah, I mean, and obviously you also have the framework where like this is the first version that you saw.
Yes.
So I have to imagine that in particular that would mean that like you're sort of overlapping those understandings on top of each other, and then it's been a while since you've reapproached it. So I have to imagine it is very hard in that scenario to distinguish what story point or plot point originated from which thing, other than the obvious ones like Dante or something. That are like really obviously only from this show.
Or there's, characters who I think go through the same plot motions but have a slightly different valence in this one. Like, I think Hughes is one of them. Hughes doesn't have anything additional in this show necessarily, but because of how his, like, life in the show extends over more episodes and a longer period of time for the Elrics, it plays out a little. There's just things like that are just more tonal than anything. And because this is adapted on a different time frame, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So before we dive like fully deep into the manga, there's some like overall kind of like production stuff I think to cover just to give it a bit of a framework. So, the mangaka, and we're going to use the word mangaka when we talk about manga stuff on this podcast, because saying manga artist or author feels inaccurate, because the way we talk about American comic books is framed through like we have a bias towards the writer, and most American comic books have a different writer and a different artist, whereas it's more common for manga to have one or the writer and the artist to be the same person. That's not always the case. It's just more typical. And so mangaka is just kind of like the word I'd like to use, because it's just gets rid of like the weird bias we have when we talk about like the writer or the artist or the author of Fullmetal Alchemist. It's like those are all the same person. So Arakawa started writing, or became the mangaka for Fullmetal Alchemist in July 2001, which I do think is like an important piece of context, that it is before 9/11 happens. It's like, it's obviously like, there had been wars in the Middle East, but it's before the like Iraq war, it's before the Afghanistan war. So like that's a piece of context that's very different when the anime is made in 2003, that like global politics are very different. So like that's one of those things you were talking about, that the political scenario in which these two products are made, the manga and the TV show, are fairly different. The manga, as you said, Jonathan, was a monthly published manga, so its chapters are 40-something pages long, double the length of a weekly manga, and it was published in Monthly Shonen Gangan, which is published by Square Enix. Square Enix still owns, or it was originally published by just Enix. Then after the buyout happened, or like the merger happened, it became Square Enix. So Square Enix still does own Fullmetal Alchemist, which, if, the crazy video game world we live in where everyone's buying everybody else, someday maybe Microsoft will own Fullmetal Alchemist, was a thought I had the other day. And that was a scary thought. I don't know. I don't think that'll happen, but it would be weird. But anyway, so it published in, Monthly Shonen Gangan, and Fullmetal Alchemist was hugely popular immediately as a manga, like very successful. So successful, obviously, that they eventually started talks to make the anime version well before there was honestly enough of a manga really to reasonably do that, because it was before the 6th volume was finished and published that they started production. The 6th volume was finished and published around the time the anime show started. And the 6th volume, for context, is when all of the flashback stuff happens in the manga. So you don't have the full version of like what happened when they did the human transmutation on their mother. All of that story was not done and published by the time like production started on the anime. So the episode 3 here is super different which is where they do the flashback in the TV show, is super different than the flashback in the manga, because that flashback was not finished by the time they started working on episode 3 of this show. So when we kind of say it was adapting the first 6 volumes, that's not entirely accurate, because it's kind of adapting it as it goes along. So as things come out in the manga, while the anime is being made, they start rolling those things into the anime in later episodes, like all of Volume 7 was releasing over the course of the anime's lifespan, and that's all the greed stuff. So, like, as the early episodes of this anime were coming out, the greed stuff was happening in the manga, and they started writing the episodes to then have greed be in the anime 20 episodes later.
The first volume of the Funimation DVD, they have a translated statement from Seiji Mizushima about how he was approached about the project, and he had already read volume 1 and thought it was good, and then he was approached would you be interested in maybe helming the adaptation of this? And then he went to the bookstore and looked for more, and volume 2 had just come out on shelves. So at the time Mizushima is thinking about making this, he had 8 chapters. It's a tiny slice.
If he could have gotten the magazines they were published,
exactly,
and obviously there were more chapters published, but those were the completed volumes that had been
right.
released. So and it is also phenomenally difficult to find the exact release dates of some of those chapters. It is very annoying. It's you have to do a lot of digging. And at a certain point, I was I'm just going to stop. Because people just usually put the publication date as whatever the tankobon release was. But yeah, so it was hugely popular. They started very early on. They started to say, hey, let's go make an anime out of it. And so the studio that got the project was Studio Bones. This is very early in Studio Bones' life. Studio Bones started in 1998 as kind of a spin-off of Sunrise. Well, not a spin-off. It was a bunch of people who worked at Sunrise Studio 2, left Sunrise to start their own anime company, and that's what became Studio Bones. Studio Bones works off of having different... It's one big studio that has different sort of satellite studios within it. And so for a while they had a Studio A and a Studio B. Studio Bones formed a Studio C specifically to make Fullmetal Alchemist, which I think an interesting thing is they then later made a Studio D in 2008 for Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. So Fullmetal Alchemist is a really kind of seminal work for Studio Bones. They had a couple of big shows like Wolf's Rain beforehand, but Fullmetal Alchemist was their biggest project at the time, and it's one of the things that really put Bones on the map, and then obviously continued to do so when Brotherhood happened. To make the anime, Studio Bones hired, as we said his name a couple of times, Seiji Mizushima, who at the time would have been best known as the main director for the Shaman King anime adaptation that had wrapped up in 2002 at about 70 episodes. That was his big claim to fame, which that is an obvious sort of hiring choice. To say, hey, let's go get the guy who just did another big shonen weekly, or for that weekly manga adaptation. Let's get him to do the Fullmetal Alchemist stuff. Mizushima would later be better known, and particularly for listeners of Weekly Suit Gundam will know that he, a few years later, 2008, started making Gundam 00. So that's, hey, it's a big thing. And then he's made a bunch of cool stuff like Ungo afterwards. The main writer for the show is Sho Aikawa, who hasn't worked on a bunch of stuff that I'm super familiar with, but has a bunch of writing credits. He's worked on a lot of stuff, a lot of Studio Bones things he's worked on. So I think he kind of was an in-house writer for that studio for a while. So they started working on the anime, and then if people are curious about what Arakawa Hiromu, the mangaka, her relationship to the anime was, there do have a couple of quotes that I found interesting, that she was quoted in interviews around the time of the release of this original version of the anime, where she says, this is me pulling a quote from Japanese off of the Japanese Wikipedia, and I'm just kind of quoting it off the top, or translating it off the top of my head here, but she's basically saying that there's no reason to in regards to them changing things, that she felt that there was no need for them to do a version that is 100% accurate to the anime, because there's no need to do that because then you're not taking advantage of what you can translating it into a different media. And so she was quoted as saying that, and then she also later said that as long as the kind of core or the root, she uses the word nekko, so the root or core part of the series is not sort of changed or swapped out, then they can do whatever the fuck they want. I really like the way that she says this. Is she says omoikiri yachatte okay. It's just you can just go for it. Just do whatever you want as long as you respect the core. You can just go for it. And so Arakawa Hiromu did have like a fair amount of involvement, from what I understand, in making the anime. They did consult her on a couple of like narrative points. So I think, like Hohenheim is very similarly characterized in this show and the manga. That his like main appearance in the manga is like way later. And I suspect that the reason why that's so similar is that seems to be one of the things that she sort of consulted on and said, hey, this is kind of my idea. He's like hundreds of years old, and this is kind of his attitude or his characterization. So she had some amount of involvement. She was involved in it, for sure. But she also like very clearly said, hey, you do what you need to do with it, and you do your anime stuff, and I'm going to do my manga stuff. And if you need some help, I'll help out. But that is what it is. And then one other point that I just find this funny when I was looking stuff up on the Japanese Wikipedia, just as also like a little note for our Weekly Suit Gundam listeners, is that this show, Fullmetal Alchemist, it was super popular when it aired in Japan. It got really good ratings, and it aired in the same time slot that Mobile Suit Gundam Seed aired in, and that was then the same time slot that after this show, Mobile Suit Gundam Seed Destiny aired in. And for people who don't know, Gundam Seed, hugely popular, and Fullmetal Alchemist basically had roughly the same ratings as Seed and Seed Destiny. So it was like a very popular time slot that Fullmetal Alchemist got put into. And I just thought it was funny when I looked it up, and I was like, why is this article talking about Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny? Oh, that's why.
Yeah. And, just spinning off of that, Sean, if you don't have any more of the background stuff, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just that, I do think as a production, this show is generally pretty impressive. I think the animation for the time, this is a standard definition production from the early 2000s. I would say this is much more impressive than like Gundam Seed, for instance, and just in terms of animation and fluidity, and the background work in this show is frequently very gorgeous. I think Mizushima is a fantastic director, and I think this show is often, even in episodes that I don't like the story changes they've made, I think it's very strikingly directed and put together, and just shot choices and camera work and all the basics are well done. It's got a fantastic voice cast, particularly the two leads we need to just give some praise to, because Romy Park and Rie Kugimiya are both phenomenal in this. And most importantly of all, Michiru Oshima's musical score is, I think, an all-time great anime score. It's just phenomenal, and it is the best thing about the 03 show, is the music. The music is often doing heavy lifting that the show doesn't even necessarily live up to, but like it's a great score.
Yeah, the score is fantastic. Yeah, she also later did a personal favorite of mine, Little Witch Academia. She did the music for that. Also, I thought this was interesting. She did the music for the for Eco, the PS2 game, the Ueda game. So game, very different kind of music, but very good. Like, it's very atmospheric, cool music. So yeah, like, she's a really great composer, and yeah, the music definitely stood out to me as well. Also, and we'll get into it as we get into the show, but just like generally across the board, like really good opening and ending themes.
Yes.
Most of them were songs that I was familiar with, but I didn't know they were from this show, because they're all just really like kind of classic J-rock songs from this period. So you kind of run into them if you're into J-rock. But yeah, like all the production stuff in general, I think is just super impressive.
Yeah, the songs in this, and that will, I will say, continue into Brotherhood, which has, I think, an even stronger track record of, like, I don't love the last ending on this one. I love all the openings and endings in Brotherhood. But I love everything else for the openings and endings here. And this is a show that, like, I loved the music so much, I basically learned to torrent in the mid-2000s to find the music and burn a CD that I had for a long time that was the themes for Fullmetal Alchemist, and then I had to do a follow-up for Brotherhood a few years later. And so these songs are just, they're a part of me, they're burned into me, I've known them for like 20 years. They're so fucking good.
Yeah. So I mean, this was like a big production. This is something that they put a huge amount of weight into, and it was super popular. Like, and it's not a thing where it's like, oh, it's like really popular in America, but Japan didn't like it or something like that. Like, it was super popular in Japan as well. I think, like, I think if you look at it now, and I did do some digging on the Japanese internet just to like see, I think it's like it is more divisive now than it was at the time, which makes sense because, again, like, at the time, it wasn't as if like they had a whole manga and then they just decided to fuck off and do their own thing. They had no choice but to do something different. So I think everyone understood that. Whereas if you're going back and looking at it retrospectively, especially if you've read the manga, or I assume if you've seen Brotherhood, it's, I think, a weirder thing to grapple with because of how different it is in so many kind of fundamental ways. But again, it was really popular and well liked. It won a bunch of awards, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you know, there's a reason why 5 years later they turn around and do an all new adaptation that runs 5 cours, and it's also a very big, lavish production in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. At the time, it felt like forever, like, oh my god, 5 years, and then we get Brotherhood. When you look back on it now, I'm like, those two shows were made very close to each other in the grand sweep of history.
Yes, I'm always shocked when I like look at those dates because I always think like, oh, Brotherhood must have come out in like 2013 or something. And you like, it's like, no, it was like 4 years after the last anime ended. They're like, let's just do another one. Let's roll it up, boys. We're doing another Full Metal Alchemist.
I basically, because they started Brotherhood basically the fucking moment they knew Arakawa was wrapping it up. Like, they aired so close that, like, they were working off her storyboards for the final episodes, not her finished manga chapters. And I think it was basically just Bones basically had an intern calling Arakawa every day, being like, do you know when it's ending? Do you know when it's ending? You do? Okay, everyone, open the new studio. We're doing another FMA because it's popular.
Yeah, it's a huge franchise, and you want to get that money, you know?
Yes.
It's like, hey, you know, respect to the people getting that money off of that Full Metal Alchemist.
Also, there's a bunch of good stuff in the manga you probably want to adapt if you're at Bones, you know?
Yeah.
So, anyway, but we'll talk about Brotherhood more in a few weeks. We're talking about the 03 show here. We'll get into the story and all of that stuff. I do just, like, want to start right now, because I think it's so crucial to this show, with just the two main characters and their vocal performances. Obviously, this is the show that probably more than any other one thing shot Romy Park to fame. Obviously was in a bunch of stuff before this. We know her as Lauren Sahak from Turn A Gundam. She's been in a million things since. But, you know, this is her most famous role ever. And then you have Rie Kugamiya, who we know from a million... God, she's one of the most prolific voice actors on the planet. We love her from Persona 4, where she is Rise, but a million different things. I think... Like, just these are two of the most, like, indelible pieces of anime casting ever. It's really incredible casting.
Yeah, I mean, they recast a lot of characters for Brotherhood, which will be interesting to talk about when we get to that. This is a rare instance where there is more consistency in the English voiceover cast between these two productions than there is in the Japanese cast. But it was like an intentional choice, and I'm going to probably feel a good choice because I actually think the voice acting is pretty inconsistent in quality, and some of the casting I don't actually love in this as a whole. But obviously the two leads, they kept those.
They hit it out of the park.
Yeah. And for me, it's particularly Kugamiya Die. I think that's the one that's like the most impressive, partially because like Alphonse is not a sort of typical character you'd think of for her. You know, like particularly a little bit after this, like a couple of years after this, she plays Louise, the main character and familiar of Zero, which is like kind of the main modern archetype of the tsundere character, which is then what she is kind of typecast as, generally speaking. You know, you think of her as like the tsundere characters. She's Taika and Toradora, that kind of stuff. And Al is a very different thing, right? He's this like sweet little boy trapped in a giant suit of armor. You know, he's like the kind one of the two brothers. He's the sort of like patient, kind, compassionate one, whereas like Ed is more like a little ball of fire or whatever. And it's such an interesting like thing to see this like very like early performance from an actress I know so well playing such a different kind of role, and she's so good. And also I think like that Al I think has like really strong characterization in this show. I think the show has like a really good sense of Al. Sometimes I'm not always a fan of some of the stuff they do with Ed, and I think Ed is a little bit less consistent of a character in this show to me. And so I think Romy Park's performance sometimes, it's not that it suffers, but it doesn't, I think, like feel like it doesn't have as clear of a spot to sort of like target as what Kugamiya Die has as Al. So I think some of that like is a little bit of an issue for me, but Alphonse is just like, that's exactly how I imagined the character reading the manga. And obviously I knew that this was the performance. I knew that this was like who would played the character, but just like the nuances of the delivery of the lines and everything was to me like absolutely perfect, whether it was the manga lines or lines they originally wrote for the character for this show.
Yeah. What's interesting for me is, so I have seen Brotherhood all the way through in Japanese and English. I watched Brotherhood as it came out, basically, so I saw it in Japanese first. But I would have seen the 03 show in English first and several times. And then I have seen parts of the 03 show in Japanese before, but this was my first time watching it front to back in Japanese. And I was struck throughout, and I actually agree with you. I do think Kugimiya in this show is the stronger performance, just in the sense of like, I generally agree that Al is very strikingly characterized. Al is given a lot of really interesting stuff in the second half, and I think Kugimiya is just, it's a really moving performance that I think sells the kind of soul of that character in a really fascinating way. But I also don't want to undersell Romy Park is phenomenal here. Like, and I do think her best voice acting as Ed is in Brotherhood, and there are line readings she has, particularly there's one in the penultimate episode that is seared in my fucking brain, is so good. And people probably know what I'm talking about if they've seen it. But like, I still think she's amazing here. And one thing that's interesting is, and again, the Funimation dub is really good for that kind of thing. But it was Vic Mignogna played Ed in all of the versions of this. And I think he did a very good job, but Vic Mignogna was an adult man. And, so Ed has that kind of slightly older valence to him. Romy Park really does play him as a kid, and I think that's something that, like, comes through. Like, she is so good at playing, like, teen and preteen boys. She's made a career out of it. And this is just a very good version of it, where I think there is a level of, like, vulnerability to Ed here that I think really hits me very hard and in the best moments of this show. And just both of them. It's the engine that keeps this show running even when some things are weird or off the rails, is I do think those two core characters and performances are so well done.
Yeah, it's like almost like to a detriment of the show to me that like they focus so much in on Ed and Al at like the expense of like the broader cast.
They do, yeah.
That like it's almost like a double-edged sword. Like they've got two great characters and two great performances that they really cling to. I think when sometimes they're like not sure entirely where everything's going to go. And then it does mean that I think a lot of the other cast in there, a lot of the other characters end up in a very kind of weird position.
They have no idea what to do with Mustang until the final core.
I would say they don't have any idea what to do with Mustang, including the final core, personally. But
that's fair. All I mean is that he has like plot purpose in the final episodes, which is more than like they have a running gag in the middle of the show that isn't in the show anymore, which is funny because that means he never really was. That whole thing is weird. I think they go back and forth on what to do with Armstrong. And again, part of this is Fullmetal Alchemist, the manga, has a remarkably large ensemble, like huge cast, and really by the end is not the story of these two brothers, it's the story of this whole country. But out of the first 6 volumes, you wouldn't possibly know that. And so, they work with what they have, and they have a much smaller cast. And I do think that insularity sometimes is something I find really compelling about this show, because it is a much smaller scale, and sometimes it is a really awkward point that does not work to the show's favor, Yeah. And I would generally agree now, because I've seen Brotherhood in Japanese. I do think various pieces of casting are here. There's some I really like. Bradley is one that's the same in both, and he's great.
Yes, you would never recast that.
No,
because he's also the third Hokage in Naruto, and that is the exact voice I pictured. I didn't even look up that casting, but I was like, I think I just assumed it was going to be him, because it's like, who else would you get?
You made that joke about on the Weekly Stuff podcast, Hughes, that you knew who Hughes was before you'd even looked it up because you just heard the voice in the manga, and there's a reason for that. It's perfect. Yeah. Mustang and Hawkeye and his whole retinue basically got recast, and I think generally for the better. I think they're fine here, but I don't think they leave a big impression. I forget if Armstrong got recast, but there's a lot that did.
No, Armstrong didn't. Armstrong's the same, which I think that's like good. Utsumi Kenji, and he's very good.
Yeah, he doesn't. It's hard to judge because that character is such a like sliver of who he actually is, I think, in the manga, because they have so little to go on. But yes, I think he's good. But you said you had some problems with different pieces of casting, so I'm curious.
I mean, I think like, Roy Mustang is one where I know it's Shinichiro Miki in Brotherhood, and like I think I knew that. Well, I definitely knew that reading the manga because he's in the first episode he's in the first 2 episodes of Brotherhood. Yeah. So I think I already had that voice in my head. And so, I think like Okawa Toru, who plays Roy Mustang in this show, I think I kind of came to grow to like him and like the performance a decent amount, but it was just like kind of not really the performance I think I was like expecting. And I just think it's like he just isn't given that much material. And so I think it's like a little bit of a flat performance. I think generally the homunculi, I don't love the voices. I think like Lust is okay, but I know that that's Kikiko Inoue. I looked at the casting, and that's like it's like a character who I think that they're fine in this show, and then I look up who plays them in Brotherhood, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay. And that's generally my reaction. So like Kikiko
Brotherhood
Inoue
generally has a much higher profile all-star cast. This was, not that Romy Park and Ryo Kugamiya were huge stars at the time, but like they're the big ones in this one, and a couple of others, and then Brotherhood is kind of an all-star ensemble.
Yeah, I think that sort of is generally true across the board. One that is, I think, just a missed piece of casting that is not, they didn't cast him for this show or Brotherhood, although Brotherhood does have the lady who plays Detective Conan play Envy. But Envy, when I read the manga, I was like, Envy has got to be played by Yamaguchi Kappei. Like, look at this character. Oh, God.
Wow.
Look at these lines of dialogue coming out of this character's mouth. How is this not a Yamaguchi Kappei character? I just couldn't. I am so disappointed in the world that piece of casting didn't happen, because it's just, that to me was such a clear voice. Like when I was reading the manga, I couldn't hear any voice coming out of that character other than Yamaguchi Kappei. I was very bummed out.
I totally understand what you mean. For those who don't know, that's like Usopp and L and Teddy and a bunch of great characters. I can see that perfectly. I will say Detective Conan lady is really good in Brotherhood. So don't be too sad. It is a good performance, but I understand what you mean there.
Yes. Another one along those lines is Izumi Curtis. I don't remember who plays her in this. It's not a voice actress who did a lot of stuff. And she is the same actress in Brotherhood, Tsuda Shoko. I think she's fine as Izumi. I'm not like in love with the performance. So I don't think it's terrible. But this is one where like I very clearly heard Kotono Mitsuishi's voice. She's like Misato in Neon Genesis Evangelion, Sailor Moon. I don't know. Like I just like thought that was like such a good voice for that character. And it's fine if you don't get the voice actress that I want necessarily. The thing that's annoying, though, is that Koto Mitsuishi is in this show. She's just playing a very minor role. She's Hughes' wife, who's only in like 4 or 5 episodes, is Koto Mitsuishi. I was like, why, if you got her in, why not have her play Izumi? That's another, like, I just feel like that's such a perfect piece of casting.
Why would you ever waste her on a part with like 5 lines? That's weird to me. Yeah. She already would have been big at this point. That's a very weird piece of casting.
Yeah, she was huge at this point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a weird piece of casting. And then the other one this is one where I think it's a decent performance. I think it's a very good performance. It's just not like the character like I sort of had from the manga in my head. And partially I think this is just hey, we're only adapting the first 6 volumes, so he's not in it that much, is Scar. Scar's played by Ryotaro Okiayu, who I've seen in a bunch of stuff. He's Byakuya, a pretty major character in Bleach. And it's one of those things where I think it's like he does a good performance with the character, but the character's just not really what I think he is in the manga. And then I looked up the casting, and it's Miyake Kenta in Brotherhood, and he's All Might in My Hero Academia, along with like a bunch of other stuff. And that's one of those where I see that casting, I'm like, yes, that's Scar. To me, Scar is like such a kind of elemental force of nature type of character, and Ryotaro Okiayu plays him like this kind of like wandering Ronin sort of thing, which I don't think is totally off the mark, but just doesn't quite, to me, like nail what that character is. And so it feels like a slight miscasting, in my opinion. That I understand like where they got to that point, but it's not what I would do, and it's kind of not what I wanted from the character.
Yeah, I think it's a very good performance in this show for this version of Scar, but I agree with you, and actually that is one of the only roles the dub recast, and I think it's purely because the character is so different in Brotherhood that it made, I don't like the voice they had in the 03 show, just, you couldn't ever use the same voice. It's a different character. Yeah. Effectively. So even the dub, and honestly I thought the Brotherhood dub should have done a couple more recastings than it did, honestly, but like Scar is the big one they did. They had to recast Al, because one of the interesting things about the dub, and it is one of the special things if you ever want to go listen to it, is the 03 show did cast an actual child as Al, in English. It was a kid named Aaron Dismuke, who went on to then become a major dub voice actor as an adult and like a director at Funimation. They kind of did a funny thing where in Brotherhood they had him play young Hohenheim in the flashback, so they did a bunch of fun stuff with that. It is kind of a fun thing to see because it's a different approach, having an actual child boy play Al. But that meant that they had to recast Al, which is kind of funny because you couldn't imagine them doing that in Japanese, obviously.
Yes, yeah, that would have been crazy. If you recast Kugumi, it would be like a crime. It'd just be like you could go to fucking jail for it.
I know the prime minister would have to make a national address.
Yes.
Yeah. No, but yeah, I think that's a good description of the voice cast. It is a little bit of a mixed bag here and there, and some of it is I just have to imagine this must have been an absolute fucking bitch to cast because you're casting a moving target, right?
Yes.
Like, what are you casting? Like, Lust is effectively two different characters between these shows, but you're also casting Lust based on her appearance in Lior, right? Like, that's it, basically. And so there's just that's one example. Bradley is one I'm surprised they got as well as they did because you had no idea who that is yet when you're casting it. There's just a bunch of things like that where it's you're casting a moving target, and that is hard.
Yeah, and because we didn't say his name earlier because I couldn't think of it off the top of my head, just to make sure I actually shout him out by name. It's Shibata Hidekatsu is who plays King Bradley. And again, if you're a Naruto fan, he's the third Hokage. He's just such a great character, great performance. He's in like a million things. I feel like that is a character that you can cast Shibata Hidekatsu as King Bradley purely based on the character design. You don't even need a line of dialogue. You don't need to know his function in the plot. It doesn't matter. You look at that dude and you're like, I'm going to get this guy to play him. It's just like, because as you say, when they started writing this show, they would not, unless Arakawa told them that he was going to be a homunculus in Wrath. Like, there's no way you would know it based on the early appearances in the manga. And it's so much so that I suspect that they didn't actually really know because that comes in so late in the anime with no clear setup for it that I thought that they weren't going to do it. I thought he was just like a guy in this one for a while because it just feels like it's one of those things where you just don't know exactly what you're going to do with the characters when you're adapting this weird moving target. And
his kid is just a kid, whereas the kid in the manga is he's like the biggest sub-boss under Father, right? So it's hilarious when you see some of those things. Salim has a very different role in this one, ultimately, than he...
I was shocked when he showed up at all, because I was like, wow, they got him in, because I think he only appeared in one panel in the manga at this point.
Because you talk about they get up to Volume 8. Volume 8 is when you find out, and it's like the last thing they adapt, and they're like, oh, well, he's a homunculus, let's put that in there, Yep. It's because, up to the point where, because one of the main homunculus in this show, their version of Sloth, is his secretary, it felt like that's how they were making up for the fact that they didn't know Bradley's role, is they were hedging their bets having the secretary be a homunculus, and then they were able to adapt that later, but, it becomes redundant. It's really interesting. But I think that's probably a good lead-in, Sean, to talk about the show itself, and I think you are right about the four cores being pretty distinct, so do you want to just take them one at a time?
Yeah, so let's talk about the first core, which I don't know how people generally feel about this one. I think the first core of this show is, personally, I think it's disastrously bad. I had a really hard time getting through the first 12 episodes. I was really worried when I was watching them because I was like, I don't want to come on to our first episode of our first proper episode of Japanimation Station and trash this show that everybody watched as a kid and loves to death. And if the rest of the show was like these first 12 episodes, I would be very scathingly negative on the show as a whole. Luckily, I think it becomes really good once you get to episode 13. But yeah, I really did not like the first 12 episodes of the show.
Okay, so my feelings will not be hurt. I'm fine. Go off. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts because the thing is, this show starts with a very faithful 2-episode adaptation of the Lior thing. Then you go into this long flashback, which starts with the one about their mother, which I do think is one of the best episodes of the show, is just the one about their mom. I like that one. No?
I can't agree with that at all.
Okay.
But okay.
Okay, that's fine. I like that episode. But it continues to be in flashback for a while, and then we catch up later on. So, but go off. Tell me. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think for me the big problem, and again, I want to stress that like I have no choice but to see this through the lens of me having recently read the manga. So like there's going to be stuff I have an issue with that if you don't have that framework, if this like is like actually your introduction to these characters in this world, I think you can overlook things about it that if like that's not your perspective and you already have all that information because you've read the manga and all that stuff, like it's harder to sort of enjoy in that way. And I think there's kind of two things going on here. One is there are a lot of really, really bad anime-only episodes in this stretch. Episode 4, A Forge's Love, I think is just a really bad episode of anime.
It's the worst episode of the series. It's terrible.
It's terrible. It's terrible. There's, I don't like the two-parter with the, like, imposter brothers. It's, like, it's not awful, but it's so disposable. And then those characters inexplicably come back in the home stretch for a very weird, like, plot Hail Mary. And then the Phantom Thief episode is another one that to me it's not as nearly as bad as episode 4, but just a really annoyingly nothing episode of a TV show. And then there's some stuff like episode 8, which is the one where they have Barry the Chopper come in. We'll go off later. We'll talk about like Winry and how the show uses Winry, but I really don't like almost across the board how this show uses its female characters, with Winry being, I think, probably the one that's the most frustrating. But there's just a lot of stuff like that I think the show gets off on the wrong foot. It moves incredibly slow, the pacing for this early section, because this is all before the plot of the series starts off. And so it is like just crawling to the point where actually the plot happens. Most of this is just Ed trying to get his like alchemy license, I guess, is kind of the plot for half of the first cour. And this is after you already have had the Lior stuff, so you know eventually they're going to be looking for the Philosopher's Stone. Nothing about this section is like building off of that goal in any meaningful way. And so it just feels like the show spinning its wheels, throwing a bunch of anime original episodes at the wall, doing some like, I think, messing with what is really strong material in the manga. Some of which is like, I don't know how much of that is because they didn't have all that material. Like episode 3, that flashback episode is fine. It's just so much worse than the flashback in the manga. It is like painful how much worse it is. That like, I just find it like, it's very frustrating to watch because it just feels like the show doesn't know what it wants to do or what it wants to be. And so it's just spinning its wheels until eventually Scar comes in and the actual plot of the series starts. And in order to justify their spinning their wheels, they just made this like prolongated, weird pseudo flashback thing that is like half an adaptation of this stretch of the manga, half a prequel to this stretch of the manga by going into detail about his life before him getting his state alchemy thing, which I don't give a shit about. It's not like relevant or interesting for the story.
So, one thing I'll say up front is that I think one of the masterstrokes of Arakawa's manga is having the courage of the conviction to start relatively in medias res.
Yes.
And go. And just go for it. And then when we do get the flashback, it is at a turning point in the story where a lot has happened. The Elrics are at a relative low. They meet Izumi Curtis again. And then we go into, and I think a lot of people who have seen both anime wouldn't even know this because Brotherhood also fucks this up. I will say off the bat, because neither show has the courage of the manga to like not hold the audience's hand on this. Both of them think if you don't do the stuff about their mom right off the bat, you'll lose the audience, which is weird because in the manga, the Lior chapters do actually a very abbreviated version of it where Ed talks to Rose and tells her, hey, this is what happened. So you do have it broadly, you just don't have the specifics. But neither anime trusts the audience on that. And in the manga, it's an extremely effective way to introduce the story because you are, like, this is one thing that is just generally true about the manga. The manga is very present tense. And even when you have that flashback comes not just at a character moment, but at a plot moment where things happen in the flashback that then become very relevant to what they are doing going forward, right? You've read it more recently than me, but this is my memory of it. And so it's like a moment where it's still kind of present tense because the Elrics are now thinking about their past. And both versions of the anime decide to go for a more flashback, nostalgia-heavy route. Brotherhood less so. What Brotherhood does is it does an anime-only episode to start, basically just to welcome everyone back in, because it had an impossible task of being a sequel anime and a new adaptation of the same material. So they do this anime-only thing to start. Then they do a single episode flashback about everything leading up to Ed becoming a state alchemist, skipping over the Izumi stuff again, just like this one does, which is weird. And then they go into Lior, and then I think those first three are really rough when we get to Brotherhood, and then it gets good from that point on. And then it is a very faithful adaptation for the most part. And then, but this one, it from Lior, it goes into this long flashback. I think that stretches up and down. I don't think it's always. I think there's some that I like and some that I don't. I think there are some interesting choices here. I think there is pervasively throughout this show a different frame on events where Arakawa's manga is very present tense and Mizushima's anime has a different sort of valence of nostalgia and memory around it, where every episode before the theme song is this spiel from Al about how what alchemy is. In those days, we believed it to be the truth of the world, and it is about this explicit, like, kind of memory framing of the past that will be shattered over the course of the show. And I think doing more flashback material and moving some events from the manga into the character's past to make them more primal events going forward, like the Nina stuff, like some of the other things they sort of put there. This does not mean I think it's always good, but I do understand some of what they're going for. I agree the execution is a little rough. I am less down on the other anime-only episodes. I think one interesting thing is that when you read Fullmetal Alchemist, the manga, one of the things you said on the Weekly Stuff podcast is you mentioned how it's one of the only huge plot missteps in the manga is when they introduce Dr. Marco, it's literally, hey, look, he's there on the train tracks. There's Dr. Marco. And it's like Deus Ex Dr. Marco, basically. And I feel like the creators of this show had the exact same reaction as Sean Chapman and went, okay, we're going to devote a weird amount of time and energy to fixing this problem, because most of that stretch, once you catch back up to Lior and you have the Phantom Thief episode and then the two episodes with the Elric impersonators, all of that is building up to a much more fulsome integration of Dr. Marco as like this thing they're looking for. And some of that I do think is an improvement, but it's an improvement to one minor weird moment in the manga, not a holistic problem. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the great irony, because I agree, like, you know, clearly, and the Dr. Marco stuff generally is done better in the show, I would say, or the early Dr. Marco stuff. Obviously, Dr. Marco is like a much bigger character in the manga because he's alive and he goes on for the rest of the whole show. I mean, he survives the whole show, or the whole manga. But the early Dr. Marco stuff, I think, is better done here in general because they're kind of planning for it in a way that feels like in the manga, Arakawa's like, shit, we need to, like, create a plot reason, like, way for them to get, like, more access to the Philosopher's Stone information and just kind of move the plot forward faster. Let's just make up a Doctor Man that they can just meet. And it's, like, a little bit goofy. And since the tone of the manga is fairly light, or it has, like, a very comedic quality to it a lot of the time, I think it is able to generally pull it off, even if it is very silly. But the thing that's ironic is that they create these two characters, these imposter Elric brothers, in order to smooth over the crazy plot coincidence of Dr. Marco, only to then later use these brothers for an equally or even greater ridiculous plot coincidence, which is, oh, we just happened to find a letter from our father when he worked in Central who knew where, like, the secret crazy near automata level is underneath Central City, and we're going to find it and give it to Ed, and it's like, it's Toka Kokon. It's the law of equivalent exchange. In order to get rid of one plot coincidence, you need to manufacture another plot coincidence somewhere else in the plot. You know, I respect the, like, adherence to the source material in a philosophical way, I guess.
It's very true. Because I've seen this show before, Sean, and I was scratching my head throughout that final core being, how does Ed find the underground place? I do not remember how Ed gets in there. For a while, I was on I think Lust shows him, and then Lust gets killed, and I was misremembering that Lust gets taken as prisoner down there in an earlier episode, and then what it wound up being was something that I had scrubbed from my memory because it doesn't bear remembering, which is the other Elric brothers come in, and they have, like, here it is, here's the plot, Ed, go here.
Yeah, it's basically like, fucking Spaceballs, and they just, like, found the VHS tape where they, like, found the plot and just, like, rewound it or whatever. Like, that's more or less what they did. It's like, we just found the page in the script where you found out where it is. Here you go, Ed. So it's just a weird thing about that specific moment is that they put a lot of energy into smoothing over that Marco thing, only to, that energy has to be spent somewhere else, I guess.
Yeah. But this is something, because we're going to have to talk about this again with Brotherhood. Why is it that neither anime adaptation trusted the audience to stay present tense? I think this show has more of I do think there's a thematic thing they're trying to go for that does not entirely succeed. Brotherhood completely baffles me on that one. But, like, it's so effective in the manga, and I'm sad there is no anime adaptation that does that faithfully.
It is really weird to me because it's a thing with the manga. I think it's a really powerful storytelling device that the manga uses that a lot of other stories hinge on, and that's going to be something we'll talk about here that I think, like, hurts a lot of these early stories that get lent, like, power and narrative weight by the fact that you don't have all the information from the flashbacks yet, and they're used as, like, a prolonged introduction because you're starting in medias res, that once you remove that context, the stories feel, like, pointless. But one of the things that the manga does, and it is, like, consistent across the whole thing, is that the manga is a series of bigger and more broad and more dramatic flashbacks that are revealed to you. Like, it's not just Ed and Al and their backstory. That's the focus of the first 6 volumes, is revealing that information, and as you say, Jonathan, is doing it elegantly by combining, like, the plot mechanics of what is happening in the present tense to then have the past naturally reveal itself, and the past and the present feel collapsed on top of each other in that way, and it's very satisfying. It's one of the, or, like, not one of, I think is the most effective maxi plot, like, storytelling chops that the manga has, is how well it balances those things. But once it moves past that, and obviously this is information that this show would not know in its adaptation, but it's just, like, traits of the manga in general and storytelling style, is once it moves past that, then it is, like, bigger flashbacks about, like, Ishval and, like, the world at large, and how Amistris was made, the city from before Amistris where the little man of the flask was created, all that stuff, right? You're getting these, like, bigger flashbacks that then are, in classic shonen manga fashion, is this kind of Bildungsroman story for Ed and Al, where they start very small, focused on their personal shit, and then it becomes about them, like, facing up and, like, recognizing their personal shit, and then seeing how does that shit reside in the rest of the world, and, like, the history of this place, the people you're around, the adults in their lives, the things that they've done, the lives that they've lived, these other cultures, these other places like Sheen, and then this city, this town, this state that you live in that has controlled and manipulated you. What is the history of this place? And it's about revealing and digging out the history of all of these things because it informs who you are in the world you live in and expands those things out. And that's, like, one of the major themes and storytelling devices of the original series, and it's really frustrating to know that Brotherhood doesn't do it. And obviously Brotherhood will do it to a certain extent because there are other flashbacks, but that doesn't do it like the full way. And this show, I think, suffers by not properly using that flashback structure, because it means that some of those first volume stories, like Lior, feels pointless to give you this sort of, like, in medias res opening that is designed the way it is because you don't know the backstory. To do that and then immediately just go into the flashback, the big flashback, it's like, well, why did you do the, like, protracted intro that is in medias res in the first place? Like, it's a lot of, like, plot material to work through that you're just kind of, like, throwing away the kind of intrigue of by then just immediately transitioning directly into the flashback. Like, if I was going to do the flashback early on, I would literally not do Lior. Lior is not important. It is only exists as, like, a cool way to introduce your characters in the middle of the story rather than starting from the actual beginning of the story, which is them trying to perform human transmutation on their mother. That's the only reason Lior exists. If you're not using it for that, cut it out. Like, obviously they create a, like, necessity for it way later in the 4th cour of this show, but for a long time I was like, why the fuck would you spend 2 whole episodes adapting Lior when, like, you're not getting any real, like, meat out of it because you've just done the flashback episode immediately afterwards.
It's extra baffling in Brotherhood because they do a Lior episode after the flashback.
Right.
And it is the worst episode of Brotherhood. It's utterly pointless. It's completely, you can't, the other thing is Lior is 2 chapters. It's too much to fit in one episode. It's just all of it is like bad, and I don't know why they did it. But whatever. So yeah, that's the thing. I actually think in a vacuum, first 2 episodes, I think is a really good anime adaptation of Lior. I like it as a starting point. But it's the same thing I feel about the manga. It's stronger if it's the actual starting point, and then you don't go into a flashback, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is because Lior is designed as a story to be a series of revelations about these 2 weird travelers who come into this city, and you find out over the course of that story why, or that this guy in a suit of armor is not a guy. He's a little boy, and there's nothing in there. And you find out Ed has 2 mechanical limbs, and that they're all of this kind of stuff. And I agree. Like, if you're going to put a flashback right after it, it kind of kills the purpose of it in a lot of ways. So yeah, I've never loved the flashback structure of this, or how Brotherhood then does it. It's the manga did it right, and it's trying to fix what ain't broken in both cases.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, and like it's one of the things of Fullmetal Alchemist, this storytelling structure. I've read Berserk and Claymore, 2 other like dark fantasy manga that have very similar structures to this. Both of them start in medias res with like this protagonist character is like fucked up and like has like an arm missing, or like is half demon now, or whatever. You kind of attack it at this sort of oblique angle, and then slowly reveal pieces of information that allude to their bigger past, until eventually doing, particularly in Berserk, a very big flashback arc, but later doing a flashback arc that like starts to explain that, and then does this sort of like, Russian nesting doll of flashbacks or something, where it's like or reverse Russian nesting doll, where it's like bigger flashbacks come like consuming them. And it's like, I think it is something where Fullmetal Alchemist, I think, is like very intentionally existing within that kind of dark fantasy manga storytelling structure, and the flashbacks are a part of that. And so taking it away, it just is frustrating, because then you are in this awkward situation where you do like the Lior stuff for the first 2 episodes, and it's like 6 or 7 episodes before you get back to that point. And that's where you're like looking at it like, well, why did you do this? Like, why should I have to like keeping Lior and Philosopher's Stone and all that information in the back of my head for like 6 or 7 episodes? It like, that narrative structure doesn't make any sense to me. You're not getting any value out of it.
It is an awkward, some of the things they introduce in the long flashback I think is fun or interesting. I don't mind the stuff about the alchemy exam and Ed becoming some of the stuff about him becoming a state alchemist. Some of that I think is interesting. Some of that is just also how I was introduced to it, so I have some fondness for it. Definitely seeing it now after having read the manga in Brotherhood, I think the one on the train becomes really weird. Because that is so much because that is, for those who don't know, that's chapter 3. That's the second story in and it's them coming back, and Mustang has set this up. It's a little more nefarious of Mustang when they're kids who are not state alchemists yet, right?
Yes.
There's that kind of thing. The Forger's Love episode is bad. I think they do a good job with the Nina stuff, but then you have the stuff with Barry the Chopper, that is transphobic and bad and uses Winry in a terrible way. In general, Winry is one of the characters this show never knows what to do with. Which, to be fair, Winry is like in like one scene in the manga that they'd adapted up to that point, so it's hard.
That's not true at all. That is not true.
No, she is. Okay, right, she comes in. Sorry, I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, has. They basically take every major thing that Winry has in the manga that they have to adapt, and they give it to either Ed or Al, and it pisses me off. It's infuriating.
I'm remembering. Okay, you've read it more recently than me, so yeah, I'm forgetting that. But yeah, that's weird. Okay, never mind. They didn't know what to do with Winry, and I don't get that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and I guess to like dive into some of like what we're talking about here with some of these episodes more specifically, like episode 4, we don't have to go like super deep into, but just a couple things that stand out to me is like, well, here's just a big one. And they do end up later addressing this with one line of dialogue. Ed kills that dude at the end of this episode. He's straight up like, he doesn't like cut off his head or whatever with the swing of a sword, but they're in a tussle. Ed knocks the sword out of the guy's hand. It goes flying up in the air and the guy gets impaled. And Ed and Al do not react to that at all. They just like go on. It's like, yeah, whatever. And that's a problem. And, maybe I haven't looked at the exact chapters of what would they or would they not have known about Ed's characterization, but it becomes a problem once Ed's starts having a thing that you only get like kind of in one big sequence in the middle here. It's a bigger ongoing thing in the manga, but that Ed is someone who, like, because of who he is and his relationship with Al, has a broader understanding of what, like, the value of life is and what it is to have a life and to be human. And that is a thing that they bring into this show. It's something that's like the whole point of him fighting another person who is transmuted into armor, and they put all those lines in verbatim. Those lines don't ring as true when you're watching someone who killed a man when he was like 10 years old and didn't think a second thought about it. There's like stuff like that where episode 4 feels like it was just made by different people. Like it feels, it's like the Cucur's Doan's Island thing in Mobile Suit Gundam or something, where it's like, we just got like a different set of people to come in and make this episode, and it is what it is. And it just happened to not really fit with almost anything else around it.
Yeah. It's that one is the most baffling because, to the show's credit, good or bad, pretty much all the other anime original stuff they wind up using. This is a show that tries to use all parts of the buffalo. Like, that's why they bring Lior back. It's something that I think sometimes works to the show's detriment because it makes the world feel very small, and I think it's sometimes something that works to the show's benefit in that it does, unlike a lot of other filler stories or anime-only things, it is trying to use every piece of the plot at their disposal to make this feel like a cohesive story. There's a level of effort there that you don't necessarily see in other anime-only or bad HBO shows that ran out of George R. R. Martin book kind of things, right? And so it's a two-headed beast there, but that does exist. The Forger's Love one is the one that never gets brought up again, except for that one line of dialogue, which I think someone just was like, hey, does anyone remember when we had Ed kill a guy as a kid? And then they all went, oh, fuck, God, that episode, God damn it. And then they put a little clip in.
Yeah, it definitely felt like, because it gets referenced after Ed kills Greed, which I'm fine with Ed killing Greed, and I don't have really an issue with that. But it's like, it feels like they probably wrote a line of dialogue that is like, this is the first time I've ever killed someone. And then someone in the back raised their hand and was like, you guys did watch that episode 4 we made, right? Because it bugged me for this whole show that they killed the person. It just never comes up again. I'm like, it's so fucking crazy. Another thing in episode 4 that I also think sets up this show's, I think, frustrating use of its female characters is there's a recurring character in that episode who's like this little girl who's dressed like a boy, like a kind of like tomboy girl. And it's like very tough or whatever. And at the end of the episode, as Ed and Al are leaving, she comes up and now she's in like a pretty dress or whatever. And Ed's like, oh, you look beautiful, or whatever line he says. And it's like, okay, yep, okay, this show's going to have some stuff with this. And it was a portent of things to come with, like, not really allowing most of the female characters who aren't antagonists to feel like important in any way that actually like mattered to the plot.
It's very true for this version because the manga has a ton. I mean, here's a great one, Sean. Armstrong's sister. Yes. Think of how this show, to be fair, they wouldn't have known Armstrong had a sister from the manga. They wasn't that far. But they do an episode where Armstrong gets a sister, and it's a joke about how she isn't ugly because they think she's going to look like a man, and it's very sexist and bad. And then Armstrong's sister in the manga is maybe an even more important character than Armstrong himself, like, to the manga. Like, huge character.
So, to be fair, Jonathan, that is actually one of the Omake chapters that they do adapt from the manga is, what is his name? Fury or whatever goes to
I did not know
Armstrong's manor. Yeah,
okay.
Like, I don't even, it might not have even been published in English. I don't know. It's just like a little, I mean, they expanded a lot because it's like 5 pages in the manga. It's like the Black Hayate Go, like the dog one that they also adapt as one of the parts of episode 13. It's one of those.
Those are in the English manga. I must have just forgotten because it's one of the, like, it's a fight.
It's super minor. Yeah, it's super minor. It's kind of whatever. But yeah, so that is technically from the manga, but I didn't like reread that chapter to see everything they changed, but they do way more with it. So it's entirely possible that it is way grosser. I just can't speak with authority because I would have to go look at that chapter again. But
yeah. So that's not a perfect example though, because Arakawa had some relationship to writing it. No, but I mean, the manga generally has a bunch of great female characters, Winry chief among them. Like, Winry is a very well done version of that kind of character in the manga, I think you would say.
Winry is as important a character as Ed and Al. She has as much like agency and activity in the plot. Like she is as central as Ed and Al. Like Ed and Al are less of like they are the main characters, but they are not like the only characters, which is kind of what it feels like in this show. And like Winry is essential in a lot of major stuff in this section. Like allowing Ed and Al to overcome their like inability to communicate with each other after the like Warehouse 5 stuff. That's Winry does all of that, and they take all that stuff away from her and give that all to Ed and Al.
So let me tell me that I'm going to say this, and correct me if I'm wrong. The manga's chain of events is Lior, and then a couple of one-offs like the train thing, the one with Yoki, the guy who comes up later in the manga, where Ed pretends to turn the lead into gold. Then they get back to Central. There's the Show Tucker episode, and then there is Scar comes in after that. And then when Ed gets his arm blown off, that's when Winry comes into the story, because she has to, and that's when they introduce her into the, and then she's with them for a long stretch of the story after that, right?
Yeah, because she comes to Central, and then they go to Rush Valley, and Rush Valley is a much bigger thing. You know, all the baby stuff is all, like, Winry deals with a lot of that, and she's very central in that whole side, and they take that, shrink that little baby story down, give that to Ed and Al to be, like, Hughes's, the birth of Hughes's daughter, and that's, like, episode 6 or something here. So that's another example.
Yeah, there's some things from early in the manga they do not readapt for Brotherhood. That one is one because they clearly wanted to do the full version of Rush Valley because it's so crucial to Winry, you have to do it. And so that does get readapted in Brotherhood. Yeah.
So that's like, a sort of example of a lot of how they move those things around and give a lot of Winry's major plot events to either Ed or Al, like to the expense of Ed and Al as characters. I think Ed and Al are vastly less interesting characters here than in the manga because they don't have interesting characters to play off of. It's just them on an island. And when you have like a really rich ensemble, one of the things that ensemble enables is it makes all the other characters on the ensemble more interesting because they have more things to do, right? So Hawkeye, who is a much richer character in the manga, even including in sections that they had to adapt, obviously she has a lot more stuff also later on that they wouldn't have known about, but Hawkeye is a much more significant character. She has a lot more lines of dialogue. She interacts with Ed and Al a lot more. Most of that stuff is taken away, either cut or it's just given to Roy. And it's like, it makes every other character less interesting because they don't have a cool character like Hawkeye to interact and like expand their worldview. And it's a very consistent thing that I think particularly these first 12 episodes fail with, is like, this is the space, this big empty space the show has made for itself as establishing material. The plot is not happening in the first 12 episodes because the plot doesn't really happen in Fullmetal Alchemist really until Scar comes in. And that's like chapter 6 or like the end of chapter 5, which is the Show Tucker stuff of the manga. That's when like the serialized story of Fullmetal Alchemist really starts, is when Scar comes in. Up till that point is a bunch of one-off stories. And they protract that out until you have to get to like episode 14 before Scar comes in. This is a huge stretch of story to give you space to do what you want with. And to me, it's so much wasted space because you are not only are you not using that space like efficiently for your main characters, because I think it's a lot of kind of nothing stories like episode 4, you're also robbing all of your like other supporting characters of material you could be giving to them to make them more interesting that they could have used in whatever way, right? There's nothing saying that they couldn't give Hawkeye a bunch of material that didn't exist in the manga later in the show. There's nothing saying that they couldn't do that with Winry. They just chose not to do that with those characters for reasons that might be obvious if you look at what is the thing that those characters have in common.
You know, I think maybe elephant in the room here, and I don't want to be gender essentialist, but Hiromu Arakawa is a woman.
Yes.
And this show is mostly made by men. And I do think that shows. I think there's like, I think you can tell reading Fullmetal Alchemist that it was written by a woman. There's for a shonen manga, I think there's an uncommonly smart use of female characters in that manga.
Yes.
And not to say that men can't write good women characters or women can't write bad women characters, but Arakawa there is a sensitivity there. And then I do think that is largely gone from this version of the story. And again, I think so many of the changes here wind up being, as I said, two-headed beasts. Because I think you're totally right about Ed and Al are kind of on an island in this show, and they are the full, always center of gravity, right? Yeah. I think Ed particularly suffers from that, because Ed is someone who gets, in the manga, split off from Al a lot and meets a lot of people, because Ed has more growing to do, frankly. Like, Al... I mean, Al has a lot of growing to do, but he's an innocent, he's a kid. Ed is someone who is in the middle of growing up and is the person who like needs to see more perspectives. But because we don't really get that in this version, Ed is always tied to Al and therefore tied to his understandable guilt over what happened to Al and the transmutation of their mom.
Yeah.
And I think some of that leads to interesting places. This show is much more about the whole ideas of like guilt and sin and regret from start to finish, and they build that into the main theme of the confrontation with the homunculus and all this kind of stuff. The downside of that is that it can never move past that, so that's the whole world of the show. It means it's inevitably going to wind up in a pretty dark fucking place. And then also, Ed's characterization is much smaller, and I think you could argue he doesn't wind up having much of an arc of growth over the course of the anime because he's always stuck in that primal trauma.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that would be fine if it wasn't a 51-episode show, right? Like, it's so much time to be spent on that, where it's like, it's just the show doesn't need that much time. And I'm sympathetic to that. Like, they didn't choose that, it's like Mizushima didn't get to pick that. It's like, I don't want to pick on the show because I know that, like, the conditions of how it was made from that sense are, like, not particularly hospitable, because you have a very small slice of story to adapt into a year worth of anime. But like at the end of the day, particularly watching it so detached from when it was released, like it's hard not to feel like there's so much wasted time, particularly in this first cour, because it feels like they know that they're trying to hit this moving target. So if there's anything that I would call filler in this anime, like it feels like this first cour is a lot of filler. It's a lot of stories that don't really matter that much, that like maybe give you a little bit of character development, but it's mostly stuff that's not significant. It's stuff that could have been cut and nothing really meaningful would have changed, and it feels like it's there to build a cushion so that once you get to cour 2, you've got a really great stage set for cour 2 to just like get a bunch of really rich material and do interesting things with the adaptation, that I feel like you kind of like have to buy that with this like weird wheel spinning kind of opening section.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably takes us into the second cour in a minute, but there's one thing I did want to mention about the Phantom Thief episode, which I think I like a little more, and I like almost entirely because I think the joke where you have the Clara character who winds up, we find out, is the Phantom Thief, and Clara keeps spinning them these like sob stories about what she has to do, and Al is a naive kid who keeps believing her. That, the first time they do that, and then they do it a couple more times, but the first time in particular made me laugh very hard, and I think it's mainly because Rie Kugamiya is very funny in that moment of, like, the full, like, complete buying into it. And in general, they have fun with Al's sort of naivete over the course of the show, sometimes for much more serious ends. Like, he has a kind of different relationship with Scar in this version because he is more naive, but in a good way, where he can see the good in Scar where Ed can't. Anyway, I do find that joke funny in that episode, so I wanted to call it out.
Sure.
Yeah. But here's the thing about the second cour, Sean. The second cour is not like a super 100% accurate adaptation of the manga either. It builds on a bunch of stuff. It does it hits all the same sort of main beats of the Lab 5 stuff, but it adds a bunch of new things in there. It's where they introduce their stuff about the red water and the unfinished stones and some of that sort of material. It has a lot of differences, including, like we said before, a better version of the early Marco stuff. But it's done very well, and I think it is probably the strongest stretch of the show.
Yeah, I think absolutely cour 2 is the best stretch. And because it is like an interesting adaptation, right? It is not just taking like episodes and just sort of like taking the pages of the manga and just using them as the storyboard, which is fine. Like there's, you can do that with an anime adaptation. It can be great. But I think it is interesting that they take this second cour and say, how do we remix this material? Put some new stuff in here. Like, this is where I think you get the most of where I feel like a kind of canny use of the different political context in which this show is made versus when the manga was coming out and when, like, the stuff was being planned for the manga. And it's not perfectly faithful to the manga, but it's really good. Like, I think their use of Scar here is super effective. Their use of Marco here is super effective. Their version of the Ishval Massacre and Rebellion is great, and it's very different than what the manga is, partially because they don't have all the information of what the manga is going to give you later on. And it's compelling because it's giving you it's that quote of that Arakawa had. It's like, as long as you don't rip out whatever's like the core, you can do whatever you want. And I think this is like a good example of that. The core of this kind of story arc with Scar is absolutely still like intact from the manga. It's just that all the specifics have been adjusted to create a different kind of story using that core. And it's phenomenal. I think it's just really good.
Yes. And you know what? While we're going through the chorus, we might as well hit the theme songs. We'll double back to Core 1 in a second. Core 2, Core 2 is going to be good because it starts with Lark and Seal as your opening, with Ready, Steady, Go, which is an all-time jam for me. I fucking love that song. I love the animation in that opening. It's just great. And then I think the closing song, which is Tobira no Mukoe, is also a great one. And that one just, like, that kind of helps wrap around that, like, this stretch of the show is just kind of A-plus stuff, is because the openings and endings are so good, too.
Yes, no, yeah. Again, Ready, Steady, Go was like the main one that they used for the English language version. And so
on Cartoon Network, on the DVDs, they have all of them. But yeah,
sure, yeah. But if you watch it on Adult Swim, like, you would have heard Ready, Steady, Go. And yeah, it's like, it's a kick-ass song. And yes, you're right that it's like, it just, and I think probably Tobira no Mukoe is my favorite of the ending themes. So yeah, it's just all around. Core two kicks ass.
Core 2 kicks ass. I mean, and I broadly agree with everything you just said there. I think I think all of that stuff works. I think their alternate version of Scar is extremely well done. I think the stuff in Lab 5 gets into some very different territory, but a lot of it is done really well. I think the story after that with sometimes this gets made fun of how much Al, like, believes Barry's thing about not being real, but I completely understand why that's a plot point. It's also there in the manga in a different fashion of Al, doubting his own existence. And I think some of the stuff that comes out with him and Ed in that is great. And I think the way they do Hughes' death, just in general, that stretch of the show is very strong.
Yeah. And actually, like, I think for me, the turn to, like, the show getting really strong technically happens in the last episode of the first core. Because I also want to shout out episode 13, Full Metal versus Flame, which I think is personally my favorite episode. I think it is the one that to me is like the most interesting piece of adaptation. That episode is them taking two of the Omake chapters. One of them is the Black Hayate-go chapter where Hawkeye gets her dog. And the other one is the one where Ed and Roy fight, which happens, is like technically a flashback, I guess, in the Omake. Omake meaning extra or bonus. So when I say Omake, it's like a bonus chapter that's sort of out of the normal narrative sequence that they would give you at the end of volumes. And it's taking those and adapting those two things together, then combining that with some like original dramatic material. This is like where there's this brief moment where it feels like, oh, they're going to do something interesting with Roy Mustang that's different than what is in the manga, partially because, they didn't get into all the Ishval stuff in the manga yet. And then it kind of never really comes to fruition. They sort of gesture at it with like the Winry's parents stuff, but they have no idea what to do with that subplot. But in episode 13, you get a flashback of Roy, in like a house in Ishval where he's like staring down a young kid with an assault rifle, and they're both looking at each other. And the kid is about to shoot Roy, and Roy, lights up his fingers or whatever, and implying that he killed this kid in the war, and like he has PTSD, it's like his kind of PTSD of that experience, and he sees that flash in the moment where he's about to like finish off the fight or whatever with Ed, and that gives Ed an opening to beat Roy, which Ed loses the fight in the manga, and there's no kind of big dramatic turn there in the manga version. Again, it's a little tiny like 6-page Omake chapter, but that to me is like such an interesting use of the original material to build some moments that feel anchored of things in the manga, that gives some more of the humor and the more sort of like deftness of tone that the manga has. The manga, I think, is so rich with its tonality between like really dark, sad humans, like stuff that like really I kind of think gets you in the gut, like the Nita Tucker story, but then also really incredible humor, and it bounces between those things, I think, very effectively. And the episode 13 here, I think, is the only time this show really captures that tone very effectively, and it's so powerful. I wish that the rest of the show could get that a little bit better, but I think it is true of a lot of Core 2 gets better at kind of finding that space to kind of emulate a little bit of that quality of the manga that's so strong that the rest of the show, I think, struggles to kind of get.
I think that's pretty true. I think this one is it's always surprised me when I get back around to this one, because it could so easily be a dumb filler episode. And instead, it's very well. It's deeply felt. It's beautifully animated. It's got a lot of good character moments for Ed and Mustang and some other people on the side. It's probably the best use of Hawkeye in this version of the show, with the stuff with Black Hayate, who I wish I mean, if they're gonna do more random filler stuff with Mustang's retinue, do more stuff with her and Black Hayate. They're great.
Yes.
I love all of that. So no, and I think the other thing that I just had no memory of this. I guess maybe they'd all blended together. There are basically only 2 sequences in this entire show where Mustang meaningfully uses his flame stuff, and that is this episode and the series finale fight versus Bradley. And they're both good. I like the scene in the series finale where he draws in blood the seal on his hand to kill Bradley and all of that, because Mustang's powers are some of the coolest fucking powers in anything. He's awesome. And in the manga and Brotherhood, there's a million great scenes with him. He's just a great character in the manga, and then in Brotherhood. And here, he's just mostly absent. And honestly, you would be forgiven for forgetting he's an alchemist for a lot of this show. Right?
Yeah. 100%. It's like he's just so gone for, like, particularly like the entire third cour. I think he has almost no appearances outside of like the terrible mirror. Again, I'm finding all these weird Tokakokon things in the show.
Yes.
That, like, for everything good in the show, there's like an equal and opposite bad thing somewhere else that like they have to pay that for. Because there is another, and it's the one where they do the sister thing with Armstrong. There's another bad sort of remix of Omake chapters that is then also mixed with this weird ghost story one that is totally original. That's later in the show that they do with Roy, and it's like so nothing. And when you look at how good this episode 13 is at taking some of that comic light material from the manga, that might not even necessarily be canonical. It's in like a kind of vague middle ground, and bringing that in and doing something cool with it. Like episode 13 is so good, and the anime can't kind of replicate that. But one of the things that they do here with Roy in episode 13, and you get a little bit in this kind of early stuff in Cour 2 with the Ishval flashbacks and the Scar, is them really positioning it to me as like a mirror of like the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq War, right? Like the way that Roy is depicted in that flashback, and then similarly in the round here is where you also get the revelation for the audience, even if the characters don't learn it yet, that Roy is the person who killed Winry's parents. It really feels he's like positioned as being equivalent to a soldier in the U.S. Army being forced to commit atrocities and war crimes in what is much more clearly specifically coded as the Middle East, which is what it feels like Ishval is specifically coded as here, whereas it feels more broadly coded as any sort of like indigenous culture that has been taken over by an imperialist kind of fascistic nation, which could be read as a million things, including the Ainu, which is, we'll get into that in Brotherhood, but that is, I think, a clear point of connection, which roots into Japanese history. This feels so much more connected to the Iraq War stuff, because they also contrast it with Lior that comes in here, where Lior is like positioned as a second Ishval, which I thought they had forgotten for a while, but they do bring it back in the last cour. But that starts here, and they change Lior to be a desert nation. All of the characters in Lior in the manga are white-skinned generally, or they're like, they're the same skin color as Ed and Al, and they're all changed here to be dark-skinned, to be a parallel to Ishval. And I think, and that feels like such an intentional choice to evoke what was happening in the world at the time. I think it's like a really canny, interesting use of that material.
This is, throughout the show, the smartest stuff this version does. I mean, It really does feel like a kind of rough draft version of a lot of what's in Gundam 00.
Yeah.
Down to Gundam 00 then making the radical decision to have one of those dark-skinned kids be the main character of Gundam 00. And like, so, the kid on the other end of Roy's rifle, in Gundam 00, that would be the opening where then the Gundam comes down, right? And he kills Roy, would be like the opposite of that. But you get a lot of those themes that they're trying out here. And again, it comes back in parts of the third and then especially the fourth cour. They almost position Lior and Ishbal as like Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like two fronts of the same war. And in the same way that Gundam 00 will be, it's incredibly critical of American imperialism. And if you were a kid growing up in the mid-2000s, this might very well have been your first like chink in the patriot propaganda, right? Of like, oh, maybe 9/11 alone didn't give us license to go blow up two nations, maybe, right? Like, especially if you're a kid, especially if you, like me, were growing up in a fairly conservative household, and if you were able to draw those connections, I wouldn't call it necessarily politically radical, but for a mainstream bit of like, child-friendly storytelling, there's a lot of resonance here. And I think there's some really interesting and beautiful moments that come in with it. And I like how much it's willing to live in the nuance. Like, it makes, again, the follow-through on a lot of the stuff with Mustang is bad, sadly.
Yeah.
But I think some of the setup, like them changing Winry's death to be, because in the manga, Scar killed Winry's parents. And Scar did it sort of in a fit of pique after waking up from the trauma of having his brother's arm grafted onto him, right?
Yeah.
And so in the manga, that is an individual sin in Scar's past. And they do deal with it very well in the manga. But I think it makes total sense that you would change that in the anime, because the anime is much more interested in the systemic nature of this stuff. I think there's implications that if it weren't for the homunculus, Amestris might still be doing horrible things in this world, right? Like, it is a imperialist nation. And so Mustang is someone who is an agent of the state, and he bears fault for killing Winry's parents, but he also is someone who was told to do this. And so there's this, like, horrible, like, nuanced, like, thing that you are asked to live with, these gray areas, with a character who we find heroic, who also did something unacceptable. And it's such a good setup that I'm sad the show never finds, like, the full follow-through of it, because there are moments where it gestures to it. There's this great scene between Winry and Hawkeye on the train in episode 36, where Winry sees Hawkeye cleaning her gun and asks her about it, and there's a little bit of understanding, and then they never do what should be the follow-up of her talking to Mustang,
Yeah, that's just because there's like some stuff here of I want to point out, just because there's interesting things that when you think of it as an adaptation of one, like Scar killing Winry's parents is not a thing that has happened in the manga yet, right? So then, so that is something that for the anime is not even a change. It is just like, I find it interesting that they even identified that similarly as like a thing to investigate as a story, because it's not necessarily indicated as a thing that like you would need to follow up on that much. But they decide to make it Roy. And yeah, I think it's an interesting choice that I really wish that there was more payoff for, which I kind of feel generally for the Ishval stuff is like it ends up getting resolved, 5 or so episodes before the end with the Scar stuff. And I kind of wish that it was more, all that was tied more fulsomely together in the conclusion. And I guess I just kind of feel like it gets lost a bit near the end. But it's still like interesting material that they broke, even if like they don't like fully go through all the way with it. And then also like an interesting thing is that scene with Winry and Hawkeye. That is a scene from volume 6 of the manga, because that happens in the manga. That's in the flashback. That's one of the things that
interesting.
Yeah, Hawkeye is saying all that stuff to Winry. In the flashback, it is like positioned as two things. I mean, it's her like saying it to Winry and kind of like a parallel for Winry and potentially her relationship with Ed, but it's also because she's talking about like, you have to live your life for someone, and I don't regret that, and I'm willing to pull this trigger if it means it's for someone I love. And she's obviously talking about Roy. That is intercut or whatever, like with panels in the manga with Ed making the choice to now go be an alchemist. Because in the manga, he has this big period of time where he is like totally despondent after the failed transmutation, and then he gets sort of inspired by Roy to pursue becoming an alchemist. And that's how that sequence is positioned there. And they kind of like take that scene and rip it out there and then put it in that train sequence with Winry, which I think is like, I was glad that it found a way back into the anime, because it was a thing I was annoyed they had cut. Even if like, I don't think it's not as kind of powerful a moment to me when it's removed from its full context, but it's still like a good scene, because it's just a good scene wherever you would place it and whatever kind of new context you'd give it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And I had forgotten that specific detail, because I mean, part of it just comes so later in the anime,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Although it would have been published closer to when they were making that, it's all very confusing as you've explained. Yeah, but getting back to the second core stuff, what did you make of the sort of extended version of Lab 5 we get? It's fairly close to what the manga does for a little while, with the two suits and the fight that happens, and Ed having the conversation about, not wanting to kill these brothers who are also tied to the armor, which I think is a dynamite scene in the anime. As you noted, Sean, maybe slightly undercut by the fact that Ed has impaled a dude to death.
Yes.
But still, Romy Park, the music, beautifully done, beautifully directed. I think that's all tremendous. But then it goes off in quite a different direction after that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit mixed on like where it goes after that, because so in the manga, like that's basically where that sequence ends, right? And then like the homunculi come in, and they fuck shit up a little bit, and then Ed and Al are rescued by Marie and everyone, and they're taken back to the hospital. But they put in this longer sequence where it is them trying to. This is where they really start introducing this concept that like the homunculi are trying to get alchemists to make the philosopher's stone, which is like a plot point that they go over and over again, and it gets more confusing every time they do, where it's like, but we also have created legends to make it so that people don't want to do it, so that they don't use the philosopher's stone if they make it. It's all this kind of shit. But basically they just want to get a philosopher's stone, and they need an alchemist to do it for them. And I think that there's a moment that I find very puzzling in here where they're trying to get Ed to do it, and Ed seemingly consents to it. That I thought was a more of a he seemingly consents to doing it and then is like going to trick them, but it feels like they were going to like, no, he straight up was going to do it until he finds out that it's not just like philosopher's stone juice, but also there were live prisoners there that they were trying to get him to transmute. But there's like a line he has where they're trying to convince him, the armor suit guy, Sho Tucker, comes back in. I don't really like that they bring Sho Tucker back, but whatever. He comes back in and they're saying like, hey, like it would be more disrespectful not to use the philosopher's stone juice and use up these souls and lives that have been turned into this, because otherwise you're just leaving them there. And they would just be useless. And Ed says to himself under his breath, like, Al, your life isn't useless, is it? And when he said that, my read of that line was initially that it was a double bluff, right? And he was saying, or it was a bluff, right? He was saying that, and your initial interpretation is going to be, Al's life isn't useless, therefore I should use these useless lives to save Al. Whereas, like, and this is the characterization of Ed in the manga, and this is like a direct extension of the scene that he just had with those brothers, where, like, really he would be like, oh, Al, your life isn't useless. Therefore, these lives that are also just souls bonded to something else, these lives aren't useless either, and therefore shouldn't just be spent for selfish gains. And I thought he was setting up that transmutation circle to, like, destroy that facility or, like, something, or, like, to play a trick on them, not just... No, he was straight up just going to make a fucking philosopher's stone using up all that juice, which is made of human lives, to get his brother back, even though his brother's telling him, I don't want you to do that because it's fucked up. And then afterwards, Ed is, like, confused about why Al is upset. And that whole sequence, like, to me, just, like, is... It's a thing that this anime does a few times, where it gets a bit excessively melodramatic in order to try to, like, push characters to do things that, to me, don't read appropriately. They don't feel like that's a thing that this character would have done, certainly in the manga, but not even in this version do I feel like Ed is, like, built up to, like, that moment they have him in here.
Yeah, I don't have the exact same problem with it. I think the execution is... I don't have a problem with them pushing the characters towards bad things, especially if it's acknowledged as, like, this is wrong and he wouldn't do it, and then we're pulling back, because so much of this show is about sin and regret and mistakes. I think that scene is confused about the execution of it a little bit, as you're describing here, right? Because there's a difference between Ed being tempted by it and clearly rejecting it, but the rejection is, like, too tied to, like, the second state order revelation of it, right, and all of that. Whereas Al has a moral clarity in that scene that feels 100% in character, right? Al is excessively self-sacrificing. That is, like, a character flaw he has in the manga. Like, he is always, like, Ed is always saying, I'm going to get your body back, and then Al will be like, and I'm going to get your arm and leg back too. And Ed, you can always tell, is on the verge of saying, I don't really care, I'm fine. I got Winry and I got the automail. But he's not going to say that to Al because he knows Al is just that kind of kind person inside, right? And Ed is someone who has a much bigger sin to make up for, which the manga gets him past earlier. He never really gets past in the anime. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is, like I think it's what you're saying there. Just, it's kind of confusing. Like, I don't have an issue with them making Ed a darker character, or making him do things that are bad, and making him more selfish or willing to use the Philosopher's Stone. But I feel like you need to set that up with more intention and clarity if that's what they wanted to do. And it's, like, particularly weird to do it one episode after Ed states, like, very clearly, that I consider you an enemy who is also someone bonded to a piece of armor, to have like a human life that is worthwhile that I refuse to erase. And it's like he states that very clearly, and then it just gets very mushy. And again, it's a thing that they're going to do again with like some of the stuff with their version of Wrath. It's stuff that happens sometimes in like the fourth cour near the ending, where I think they end up pushing scenarios into melodrama to kind of hide a little bit of the confusing nature of the scenario they've made, and that some of the things the characters are saying or doing to me doesn't like really make 100% sense.
Yeah, and I can understand that. And, you know, I think a lot of what I respond to in this version of the show, and I think this is something they do well, is sort of, this is going to sound stupid, but you're going to know what I mean. It's tone and vibes. It's atmosphere. I think this show is very good at building an emotive atmosphere. I think it is very good at evoking sadness. I don't think there's any version of Fullmetal Alchemist, manga, anime, or second anime, that does a better job of making you feel the weight of like Ed's guilt and stuff like that than this version, because of the music, because of the voice acting and the production and the direction. It's very good at those things. And I think sometimes the plot becomes secondary to that. And I think it works better when you're sort of on the vibe and the atmosphere wavelength and some of the broad thematic or metaphorical things it's doing. And then there are plot things that break down, which is extra notable when you hold it next to the manga, which I do think is one of the like most well-plotted versions of that kind of story I've ever seen. Like, you know, Fullmetal Alchemist is one that, like, I feel like took a lot of the air out of Harry Potter after I saw the original version of Fullmetal Alchemist, and being like, oh, this takes like it's kind of like you with Naruto. I know you hold up Naruto against a million other things like that. And for me, it's like Fullmetal Alchemist, the manga and Brotherhood, of like, oh, it does all these things I see fucked up in Western fiction just kind of perfectly, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is not, and again, if your thing is plot coherence, you know, Fullmetal Alchemist 03 is not really going to be for you. There's a lot of plot incoherence at points, and I do think what it excels on when it excels is more the broader themes, the vibes, the atmosphere, which is not insignificant, and that's why I want to praise the show for those things. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think like that stuff didn't work for me as strongly. I think probably partially because I'm coming at it from the manga, and so it's like it's harder for that to like take precedence over everything else in some way. But like there are moments where like the tone and vibe stuff is like really strong. I mean, the episode 13 is one of those. There's another one in the second cour. I'm trying to find, I think it's episode 17, House of the Waiting Family, which is them adapting where they go back to Reasonable for the first time. And that's a fantastic episode, just like episode 13, where they are taking stuff that's like, a lot of it is very strongly based in the material from the manga, but it's not just word for word that section in the manga. They build in, and here's going to be another Tokako-con thing, because I think they kind of end up doing something that with Al here that makes them doing the Al stuff at Warehouse after Warehouse 5 like kind of confusing. But where Al is starting to like sort of suspect that his memories maybe aren't real because he doesn't remember some of the things that Ed and Winry are talking about, and he has a smaller version of the existential crisis he has in the manga that they then later adapt in the anime, which is when Barry the Chopper tells him, hey, how do you know for sure that you are who you say you are if you're just like a mind bonded to armor? But in episode 17, they do this really elegant version of it where he has that like insecurity and he's like keeping it bottled up inside as Ed is going about like getting his arm repaired. They do it like a scene I really love where they show that like Ed getting the arm refitted and leg refitted to him takes him out of commission for like a couple of hours because of how painful it is, which is not like a scene in the manga. And I think it's like, but it feels like a very natural extension. Like, oh, if they had spent more time on this moment, this is how Arakawa would have depicted it in the manga. And so there's a lot of stuff like that. And then that episode ends with this scene where Al is remembering, oh, sometimes we would go out and play, and then mom would have this like light in the second floor that she would turn on and off to tell us it's time to go home for dinner. And then they see Winry back at Winry's house doing the same thing with the light, and Al like gets really excited and runs back to the house. And it's like such a beautiful episode. It's so rich. I think it has that thing, that quality that I like of this series, particularly that the manga has in spades, which is this rich range of emotions and this really kind of grounded humanistic quality to the way it presents its characters and their struggles. And I think that episode like has all of that, and a lot of it is original material. But that's so well done in that episode, it becomes confusing when Al has a very similar existential crisis later with the Bury the Chopper thing, which feels more contrived. And it's something that in the manga like is resolved immediately the next chapter, and Winry is the one who resolves it, and they kind of have some of the Winry stuff there, and then she doesn't actually resolve it. And then they build a whole second anime original episode to actually resolve that existential crisis. And it's something where I sat there watching that thing like, why are you doing this again? Because you fucking nailed it home run in episode 17. Arguably, I would say that's a better version of that story than what they do with the Bury the Chopper stuff in the manga. You know, the manga has the utility of getting Winry involved, and that's like what it does really well. But for the Al side of that story, episode 17 does that conflict better. And then they just do a really protracted version of that conflict again, and I got frustrated by it.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. And I actually think your thesis on this show is maybe the best version of it I've heard of. It is an active equivalent exchange for every great thing it adds to the world of Fullmetal Alchemist, or how it adapts it or whatever. There is some other like thing it has to give back somewhere else, and I think that's very true across this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's weird.
So maybe for the second cour, you get the third cour. It's maybe how we would describe that shift. But before we get to the third cour, we should just talk about the death of Hughes. Done slightly differently in this version, because obviously you have the Sloth, the very, very different version of Sloth, who I never, in all my years of watching the show, have understood why she's named Sloth, other than that was the leftover name.
Yes.
Sloth,
I mean, I don't understand in this version why they're named after the seven deadly sins at all. Like they never bring that up, where it is contextualized in the manga. It feels like they're just like, whatever. They're just seven deadly sins. Let's just roll with it.
Yeah, I was surprised when I saw Brotherhood, and I forget if it was the manga first or whatever, but like they go very hard on like greed is greedy, you know, and
yes.
like that's his thing, and like that's why doesn't Lin get turned into greed and all that? And
yes,
it's because he also has this greed to him and all this. Anyway, they don't do that in this version, which is fine. Whatever. That's not critical flaw.
Yeah, I don't care about that change.
But how did you feel? The Hughes episode was definitely a big one, I remember, when this came out. It's an episode that knows it is special because it closes with a black credits roll over instrumental music and all of that. And it's definitely, I think, for a lot of people my age, it was one of the first major character deaths in fiction that maybe hit them.
So obviously, I've seen other character deaths before.
Yes.
So it didn't have that impact. I mean, I think it's well done. It's one of those where like, I think inevitably it's not as effective to me as the sequence in the manga, but it's such a high bar to try to hold it to, where like the panel where Hughes turns around and sees Envy transformed into his wife is so upsetting in the manga. Like the expression on his face, it captures such a complex emotion of like fear and regret and like and immobility, right? Like he knows that he's going to die. He knows he should do something to like stop it, but he can't. And he's fully aware that he's fucked. And there's nothing he can do, even though he should, but like because it's his wife standing there, or what he sees as his wife, even if he knows it's not really his wife, he still can't do anything about it. And it is such a powerful image that inevitably I don't think like the anime is able to like replicate how strong that sequence is. And there's like a lot of little details also that like Arakawa is so fucking good at those little moments. It's also something that's true of like the show Nina Tucker story, that like the specific sequencing is so precise in the storytelling that like any little shift to it ultimately makes it feel less effective to me. So it's like, it's not a thing where I think the Hughes version of the scene, or the version of the Hughes scene in the anime is bad. It's just like, as like a manga dick, as the person coming who read the manga and has that like thing, right, who read the source material, it's like I have like the little tiny nitpicks that mean it's not going to be my favorite version of that scene, but it's very well done.
And here's the thing, I was kind of speaking from my nostalgic experience with it. I was slightly let down revisiting it because I think Brotherhood, it's all congealed in my memory, and Brotherhood does a better job replicating those panels from the manga. I think Brotherhood on the downside is Hughes dies in episode 10. It gets to it very fast, and it's early in the manga, but I think there's an argument that Brotherhood maybe rushes to that point. And so I think there's sort of there's a too hot, too cold, and then the manga is just right in the middle. But like, yeah, I think there's a surrounding context that maybe makes the Hughes death work really well in this anime. But I think the scene itself, I actually agree 100% with you. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think he dies in chapter 15. I think in the manga, so it's like
so that's fair. Yeah,
yeah. He's not around for very long.
No.
But like he makes a really big impact.
Hughes's death is, in a sense, the inciting incident of the larger plot of Fullmetal Alchemist, and that is the thing Brotherhood does get right. And it's not the first anime's fault that it doesn't get it right, because it only had so much material, but the first anime, it's the fulcrum at the middle of the story, instead of the thing that kicks off the larger conspiracy, which is what it is in the manga and Brotherhood. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, specifically, the manga basically has 3 protagonists. It has Ed and Al as kind of combined protagonists, generally speaking. Then it has Mustang, and then it has Scar, right? And so Hughes's death is specifically the inciting incident for Mustang's story, because that's what sets him and gives him because he's got so much more stuff in the manga, and that's like his material is generally tracking that down, while Ed and Al are continuing on their Philosopher's Stone stuff with the homunculi. And then obviously eventually it intersects and all becomes like a big web, but that's kind of how functionally it works in the manga. And yeah, like the anime adapting it for its own purposes, like it's effective, like it is effective in a different way to have him around for a long stretch of time. It just means that inevitably his death scene has a different function. It does also mean, though, that like the fact that there's not a lot of follow through on it with the Roy Mustang story ends up meaning it doesn't feel actually as impactful that way in this story versus like, I mean, Roy, that stuff that pays off in like the last couple of volumes of the manga, it's like, it's Roy's whole story.
Mustang stuff following up on Hughes' death is some of the best stuff I've ever seen in a manga or anime. It is, and you know what I'm talking about if you've seen it. Yeah. It's ludicrously good, right? And instead, Mustang just kind of exits the anime at that point until the 4th cour.
Yeah, that part is weird. I mean, you do have here's another example of like a scene that is well done. I know it's an iconic scene because I've heard it quoted over and over again before I had actually read it. But the like, oh, it's raining. It's like, no, it's not. Yeah, it is. Like that thing with Roy Mustang. And here's another very nitpicky thing. I think they don't quite get that moment right in the anime. Hawkeye, when he says it's raining, Hawkeye already understands that he's about to start crying and that it's not raining, and she understands the whole emotional thing that is happening there in the anime version. In the manga, when he says that, Hawkeye is legitimately like has this reaction of like, she looks around and says like, no, it's not, what are you talking about? And she looks back at Roy, sees the tears start to come down his cheeks, and then he says, no, it's raining, and she says, let's go inside, it's getting cold. And it's like such a more human moment that like splitting that reaction between like what is the audience reading in the scene, what is Roy actually saying and feeling and doing, and how is Hawkeye interpreting it, and having those all be in different spaces is so much more dramatically rich and impactful. And it's like, it's just not as good when she already understands it when she's saying those lines. It's just not as good.
So, transitioning into the 3rd cour, this is where it gets confusing to talk about. Because at this point, the show becomes an amalgamated adaptation of the Izumi Curtis stuff, which includes the portion of the flashback where they are her students, which also then dovetails with a bunch of anime original stuff, including the anime's version of the origin of the homunculus and some new homunculus like Wrath. And Dante is introduced, but in introducing Dante, they also do a version of the Greed story from that point in the manga, and it's a lot of ping-ponging between different plots and sources, some of which works, some of which is very confusing.
Yeah, this is where you have like a couple of episodes around like Izumi and Greed that are like honestly might be the most faithful adaptations of specific chapters of the manga. Like, it's like really exact. And then the very next episode is like the most crazy shit. That's like completely different, has no analog, no parallel. There's not a single line of dialogue. And they just sort of put them next to each other. And sometimes you can kind of see how it goes together. Oftentimes there are lines of dialogue that refer to things that haven't actually happened in this version of the story. Like, I'm thinking specifically after all the stuff with Wrath happens, and Izumi, then they have the scene from the manga where Izumi sort of disbands them from her school or whatever, right? They uses the word hamon, they're like expelled. And then they go to leave, and then her husband tells them, you idiots, like, because you're not master and teacher anymore, that means that, or master and student anymore, that means you can just treat each other like equals. And they run back to Izumi and say, we came here to figure out how to get our bodies back, and we want you to help us. And I'm watching the anime version of the scene and saying, you didn't come here on purpose at all in this version of the story. They kidnapped you. You didn't even want to be here. You were specifically avoiding being with Izumi Curtis. So running back here, it's like, we came to you, Sensei, in order to try to figure out how to get our bodies back. It's like, you didn't come here at all. You were trying not to come here. What a weird line of dialogue to take verbatim that refers to a thing that didn't happen in this version of the story.
And there's a great moment that you noted on Twitter. It got a rare tweet out of Sean Chapman where they reference having seen a baby be born, which if you've, in the manga, and this is also true in Brotherhood, it's the Miracle at Rush Valley story where they go to Rush Valley and they see the baby born and Winry is involved in all of that, and it was the direct preceding event to this episode. In the anime, they are referring to the birth of Hughes' baby 4 years and 20 episodes ago. So it's a little, and it is definitely, it's baffling. I noticed it this time.
It's hilarious. It's like because they don't do anything to set up the idea that they would just say this off the top of their head. Just like the first thing they say is, "We saw a baby being born." Like, fucking what? Like, okay.
Yeah, no, it's definitely odd. And I think in general, this stretch, even I remember when I first saw it as a kid, I remember some of the stuff with Greed and his characters being weirdly vestigial. And even though the events with Greed are fairly close, as you say, to what's in the manga, when it aired on Brotherhood, and when I saw it there, I've always thought of them as just completely different, because in the right context, it just plays so differently. And I think the Greed, because the Greed story is the turning point in the manga where Father is introduced at the end. And there's a lot of big revelations that come from that. And it's kind of similar here in that you do meet Dante, although you don't see the full played hand of that until later. But in general, it just feels like something that kind of, they don't know, like it kind of came out of nowhere. And it just, even if you hadn't read the manga, it felt weird at the time, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a thing where, while the specific events are all very close adaptations of this stuff in the manga, like, obviously it diverges when, Ed doesn't kill Greed, all the Dante stuff is new, but, like, them kidnapping Al, Izumi coming, then, like, Ed coming in later, like, all that stuff is just straight from the manga. Like, lines of dialogue, word for word, long sequences of it. The entire context of everything about it is 100% different. Like the context couldn't be any more different. And so it just feels really weird because it's a thing where it's like, I feel like you're getting whiplash, because the gap between what are you pulling directly from the manga and then what is all the anime original context in other scenes you're occasionally cutting to, the gap between those things is so huge at this point. It just doesn't feel reasonable to kind of like expect the viewer to be able to overcome that gap, whether you're aware of the source material or not. Like, I think as you're saying, it's readily apparent that there is something weird going on here, because none of it really links up or makes sense really what is happening.
Yeah, and I also think like their version of Greed, it feels like the character design is off, the voice and just all of it, like, it's so clearly they had, they just kind of had these manga chapters thrown at them at the last minute and decided to adapt them, and it's just not it does not feel like a full-hearted adaptation of that material. Like, honestly, this is a stretch where I think the anime original stuff is better than what they're adapting, because it at least feels more like their heart is in it and it's coherent to a degree. And I guess this is where we should talk about one of the biggest divergence points, and I think it's a really interesting one, is the origin of the homunculus.
Yeah.
This has always been fascinating to me, because there are a couple of things that don't actually turn out to be mysteries in the manga. Like, the thing about the homunculus in the manga is that it's actually not a mystery. Father just created them. Like, there's no bigger, he just did it. It's an alchemical thing he did. There's no mystery behind what they are, how they're created. You would not be wrong, though, for reading the manga and assuming there might be a mystery there, right? Like, that's not an insane thing to walk away from the first couple volumes with. And that is what the anime does. That clearly is its reaction, is there's an assumption that there will be a twist. The twist they fill in, I think, is a good one. The idea that they come from these failed human transmutations, you're tying in the broad themes, that idea of, like, you know, sins and human mistakes kind of echoing throughout time and coming back to haunt you, makes total sense. But that's when the idea of, like, what is on the other side of the gate is also something that isn't really winds up being a mystery in the manga, that they turn into one here and it has a revelation and stuff like that. And so it's that's one of those things that's just fascinating that's kind of a thing that comes from adapting the very early portions of a story without the full context of it, you know?
Yeah, it's something that is, it's kind of weird. Like, one thing I thought was weird is I thought for like the first half or so of the show that they just weren't going to do the gate. And that because they kind of change until they like almost kind of like retroactively make it like it was in the manga again, that Ed is able to do the transmutation by just clapping his hands because he has seen the Gate of Truth. Because in the anime early on, he's not able to do it in the early flashback episodes, and he learns how to do it. He like, you know, does it by instinct or something that kind of like trains to do it a little bit. And then they later, once it gets to this stuff, they just adapt some of the scenes word for word, where it's like, no, he's able to do it because he saw the Gate of Truth, and Al didn't see the Gate of Truth, and he doesn't have those memories, and so that's why he can't do it. And then they never actually get back to that in the anime version here. They just sort of leave that weirdly hanging. And it's like, it's weird that they kind of, it feels almost like the King Bradley thing. Early on, it feels like they're not going to go for what the manga did, either because the manga hasn't done it yet, or they just don't want to do it because they don't know where it's going to go, so they just don't want to tackle it. And then later, halfway through the show, it's like, oh no, actually, yes, no, King Bradley is a homunculus, and yes, no, actually, the Gate of the Truth is a thing. We didn't put it in episode 3, because I don't know how much of the manga material was out by the time they did episode 3 in terms of the flashback, so I don't know if even they could have done the Gate of Truth fully or not. But we're going to do that, and we're going to do the clapping thing from that, and yes, it's back onto the way the manga did it, and it's really weird.
It is definitely weird, and I have to tell you, Sean, I do not remember if this was something I learned from reading the manga or watching Brotherhood, but the moment where Al, in the Arakawa version of the story, first does the clap and he's able to do it, blew my fucking mind, because in the anime, Al doesn't do that until the very last episode, and it's just not something he can do. And then in the actual story of Fullmetal Alchemist in Brotherhood in the manga, Al does that for almost as long as Ed does it. It's not an Ed exclusive thing at all. But in this version
like
of the anime,
Volume 8, I think, is where he does it for the first time.
It's so early then. That's so funny to me, because that blew my mind seeing it for the first time, because if your only point of reference was the 2003 show, well, that's Ed's thing. That's not Al's thing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very weird. But I'm glad Al got to do it eventually, because Al should get to do it too. It's cool.
Yes, yeah, because yeah, very much like a lot of that stuff, like a big part of their story in the manga, obviously, is that like Ed and Al are overly reliant on each other, and they have to learn to like grow to be individuals separate from each other to a certain extent, which is obviously like not a thing that this show really, it kind of gestures at with the very ending, but they gesture at it as the very ending of the show, not really a thing that they kind of built up as like a slow character thing over the course of the story, like what the manga does.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's some of the other stuff here of like, I guess, yeah, the big thing with like their new version of Wrath and the origins of the homunculi, like, I think it's a good idea. This was a thing that I didn't know about at all. Like, I knew about all the World War I stuff at the end. Like, I knew about that already. That had been spoiled for me fucking years ago. That I knew that before I read the manga. Or any of that shit. I had just heard it somewhere and it had been stuck in my head that, oh, there's a weird, he ends up in World War I. And I'm like, okay, that seems like a weird thing to happen. It was a weird enough thing to hear that I just kind of kept it in the back of my head forever. But I had never really heard or remembered, if it was ever told to me, any of this stuff about the homunculi. And I think it's a good idea. Some of it, I don't love the execution with their new version of Wrath, mostly for, like, I think it ends up kind of bogging Izumi down with more bullshit than it is necessary, with it being her baby, and then, like, it makes her whole character revolve around that stuff entirely, which is another way in which I think the show struggles with finding ways for its female characters to be, like, full independent kind of subjects that are active in their own story, and instead it's like she's so tied down into that side of stuff. But generally, I think it's like an interesting direction to take it, particularly once they wrap in their new version of Sloth and all of that, and how it reflects on Ed and Al.
Yeah, in general, I think it's not a perfectly executed idea. I think the character who benefits the most from it is Lust. I think this version of Lust is interesting because she is so different from the one in the manga, and has this full arc. One of my favorite episodes, and it's purely anime original, is when she has that event with the doctor in that town who she had an affair with and who loved her and was searching for a philosopher's stone to help his town. And you learn this was all part of the homunculus's plot, and it ends with her killing him. And it's basically this noir femme fatale kind of story, but she still has this sort of guilt over it. Like, she becomes a very interesting, mysterious character. And I think, but also a deeply felt character. Like, she's the one where you feel the, like, desire to become human that is supposedly driving all of them. But I think Lust is the only one who gets a full three-dimensional character out of it. Wrath, in some sense, but as you say, it's got these other limitations on it. It's very much an equivalent exchange. And I think I wish more of the homunculus got to have bigger characters come out of this revelation, because it's a super interesting plot idea that these human transmutations that are forbidden, that cause all this grief, now we add this extra thing of that's where the homunculus come from. And so it's not just that Ed and Al are fighting this thing, they created this thing. And I think some of the stuff around them fighting Sloth in the final episodes is very resonant and interesting because of that. But again, more on a vibes and atmosphere and theme level than a specific plot thing, because, you know, I think the character of Sloth, this homunculus, I'm never sure what they're going for with her exactly. Of if they are trying to make her a reflection of their mother or not. I think the show is confused about it. But some of it still works for me on the side. But overall, like, that's where when I'm talking about this show is, warts and all, very engaged with what it has been given and spinning it off and telling a wholehearted, full-throated story. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. You don't get this out of an anime that is like slumming it to kill for time until they're done with the project. You know, that is not like this homunculus. This is a version of the homunculus story that clearly a lot of thought and discussion and passion went into figuring out, okay, what version of the story are we telling? And it's distinctive, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think the main issue with it is that the revelation comes too late in the story. Like, it's just like, and I think it's kind of true of a lot of the structure of the show, is that, like, they spend so much time early on, like, you know, this is one of the things with that first cour. Like, you spend so much time on that, you don't have enough time to really pay off that stuff, because most of really the stuff with the homunculi there, that's really actually just the final cour, right? Like, not a lot in the third cour actually deals with those elements. It's more just that's where it's revealed. So it's mostly up to the last 12 to 13 episodes to give those characters space to reflect on what that means for the nature of their existence. And the only character that really do it much with is Lust, which is interesting because, you know, it makes sense because Lust is the most prominent homunculus early in the manga because she's the first one to get killed. So all of her material is front loaded. And then after her, Envy to me is like really kind of the main homunculus, with like King Douglas is kind of his own thing, right? Because he's sort of homunculus, but he's also kind of a character in his own right, a little bit outside of that sphere as well. But Envy is so much more major and like big a character, I feel, in the manga. And he's kind of, or they, I probably should say, because I don't think Envy's meant to be gendered really. Like, they are sort of on the edges of things for most of this show until they do the stuff at the end of Envy being a, like, child of Hohenheim and Dante and all that stuff, which is stuff you learn in, like, the last 2 episodes. So it just doesn't give, the show doesn't give itself space to really unpack or work through any of those ideas because it's too close to the finale for it to really spend a lot of time with it.
Yeah, the Envy stuff is too bad, because I actually think it's good what we get in the final couple episodes. I like that idea. I think, we'll have to talk about how fucking dark it gets. But when Envy winds up killing Ed, and Ed is taken aback by seeing a face like his own, like a third Elric brother, that's a super interesting idea. If I remember, there's some good stuff on that in the movie, but it's limited. Overall, it is just and I'm super curious what the production timeline on this show was. I'm curious, did they always know it was 51 episodes and then they're done? Was it like, because there is just this clear sense of acceleration near the end of like, we're going to finish it and we're going to finish it with anime original material. And, that's some of the stuff that is like really hard to parse. What was the intention versus the execution?
I mean, they would have known that they had a year worth of episodes. But like I certainly don't think they had like the ending planned out at the beginning. That's not my sense of things.
Yeah.
Like it feels like they definitely like were hitting that moving target because they were incorporating manga material as it was releasing. But they definitely always knew generally like the amount of time that they had to tell the story. But I just think it's that thing that if you're trying to incorporate manga material as you're running, the story's not really able to enter this like later phases of the storytelling until it's too late to think like kind of fully do them. I mean, because they spend everything basically that they adapt from the manga is stuff that in the manga is designed as like the introductory section, right? Keep in mind that most of what they adapt from the manga is before you get the big flashback that tells you everything about Ed and Al's past. When you get the big flashback that tells you everything about Ed and Al's past, that is like what separates kind of like the first act of the manga's story from the rest of the story. So most of this show is actually just adapting introductory material, which is why that once you move into anime original stuff, I think it has to be like on super crazy fast forward speed, because it's like, well, you spent most of your show on introduction, and that's just is what it is. Like, you kind of have no choice. You're played a shit hand. Like, I don't know how else you would deal with it. Because you can't, as you see with the third cour, you can't actually meaningfully adjust, like take material that's designed as stuff for the first phase of a story and try to make it like the mid to like latter phase of a story in another version of the story. It just clashes and is awkward and weird.
Yeah, that's where I just have like a pang of like, oh, this must have been a hard anime to work on, you know?
Yes.
And it's a miracle it's as good as it is. There are episodes in the third cour that work for me, although I will say it's more of an episode by episode basis than the overall kind of thrust of things. And for a while, it is just kind of episode by episode. I think the episode 35, which is the one I mentioned earlier about lust, it's primarily that story about lust, and Lujon, the doctor, I think is an interesting one. It does not feel like filler to me. It feels like a really, interesting attempt at this homunculus-centric story that I think there's probably an alternate universe version of this show that did more of that, and I think would have helped the show. The one after that is called The Sinner Within. That's the one where they find the Ishvalan refugees. And I think there's just some very good scenes there about, like, Ed. I posted some scenes from this one on Twitter because that's where Ed is talking to the other Ishvalans, and they kind of confront the idea of, like, racial difference and, like, Ed and Al, like, fully recognizing that this is the problem here. And this is where we're also getting, like, the second sort of civil war is starting up there. The problem is that episode ends with Winry figuring out who killed her parents, and then the next episode is a comedy interlude about that character, and it's baffling because the comedy interlude does include a short moment where Mustang reminisces about killing her parents. I have no idea what was going through anyone's minds in that particular juxtaposition of episodes, because whatever problems they had, no one held a gun to their head and said, hey, you have to juxtapose these two episodes, and that was a weird fucking choice.
Yes, I had the same reaction of where I saw that and was like, what are you doing? Why are you doing your weird, like, wacky comedy episode with characters that we have barely seen? Because, like, it's one thing with Roy Mustang being a really absent character, but, like, another thing that they do is that, they don't give any of, like, his supporting cast almost any material. You get some with Hawkeye, but she is a very small part of the show overall, particularly compared to her role in the manga. Again, even just within the section they've adapted, they've cut a lot of her material. But then you have, like, Fallman and Fury and all the other ones that don't really have that much material in the manga at this point, that are, not main characters, but they're notable supporting characters for the rest of the series of the manga that, like, this show is just sort of, like, stuck with. It has no idea what to do with. They adapted the scene where those characters are, like, formally introduced in their new role once Mustang is moved to Central. And then it's like, well, now have them in scenes, I guess. Do they have characterization? Not really. Like, there's not much to them anymore. Because, I mean, that's where you either have to, like, make it up or just say, we're not going to use the characters much. There is a weird thing along that line of stuff, and this all kind of comes in around this time of, like, early third cour, where because they've kind of messed with the timeline of things by creating the early flashback, Mustang has this weird career path where he starts in Central, then he gets moved to the Eastern Branch, and then he gets moved back to Central. Rather, in the manga, he's always in the Eastern Branch, which is, like, in the boonies. And then he has to work his way up to get to Central after Hughes is killed, and that's what gets him that window to be able to get into Central and like start like working his way up to the top. And there's like this weird, I feel like the sense of the world building and the politics of that stuff gets very confused in this version of the story because they're kind of bouncing things around and there's not a sense of like clarity about how that structure works anymore, whereas I think it's very clear in the manga how all those pieces work.
Yeah, no, that you're right. Because I had in my head going into it this time the memory of he's in the East and goes to Central, and then when they pulled the switcheroo, I was very confused by that for a couple episodes there, because they keep having to like alter dialogue to fit it, and it's just it's weird. Yeah,
and it just affects his whole supporting cast, and his whole deal gets fucked up because of that.
This and the stuff with the supporting cast is something I would not have realized watching it the first time, but having seen Brotherhood in the manga, like those are major characters who become background art in this show,
Yeah. It's
just
weird. I mean, I think I would have done the same thing were I adapting the show. I wouldn't have like tried to come up with material for those characters. I probably would have just like not used them, honestly, because it's like, what do you do? Here's like this weird cast of like 5 extra characters, and you're moving into the last 13 to 14 episodes of your show. Like, what are you going to do with them? I don't fucking know.
Right. So after the comedy interlude episode, which is bad, is when we really enter, I think, what I would call the fourth core proper, even though the theme song doesn't switch for a couple episodes. But, like, this is where we get into the final push, which is you have this arc in Lior where Scar is creating a transmutation circle to create the Philosopher's Stone, and you have all of that stuff. Kimberly is there, a version of Kimberly who's fairly different from the manga Kimberly. Kimberly is one they very much recast. And then, so you have a version of Kimberly, you have Scar's death, Al becoming the stone, and then you have the stuff after that of going back to Risenbull and then back to Central for the end of the series. And it is all, I will say I mostly like this stretch. I think it is very propulsive, if nothing else. It has to be, because they're doing basically a whole show's worth of story in the final 13. I think there's a lot of really phenomenal direction and voice acting and moments of music and imagery working together. And it is also extremely and at times weirdly dark. Like, it becomes, like, I would say the last core of this show is not a shonen show anymore. Like, it is too violent and focused on mass murder and guilt and all these things, and it has a kind of unhappy, unresolved ending. Like, it is a different kind of thing, certainly, than the manga is in its second half, which becomes more of a battle shonen kind of thing,
Yeah. I mean, it's something where it's like, it's a weird thing of where it is definitely, it's dark, but it's dark in such a like almost ridiculous way. Like, it's so, again, it gets very melodramatic to me, which is tonally very different than the ways in which the manga is dark. Because honestly, like, I think the manga is more impactful in the places where it's darker because it is so much more human. It's so much more like the doctor who served in the Ishval War saying shit like, I don't want to ever have to see a dead child again. Like, that to me is so much weightier than like we're transmuting the whole town and everyone's screaming at each other and like the kind of histrionics of the ending of this show, which I'm not saying like it's bad here, but it's a thing where it's like, when we get to Brotherhood, I think it like will lay some ground to have like an interesting conversation about like, what does it mean for a show to be dark? Like, and what are the ways in which things can be dark? Because it's like, yes, this show is darker in a kind of edgier way, but to me, like, there is a weight to some of the stuff that the manga does. I'm not going to make claims to Brotherhood. I don't know, execution might change this, but the manga to me has like shit in it that's dark that to me like hits to my fucking core in a way that none of this stuff really, like, I didn't get very emotional in the last core of the show, I guess, because it didn't really hit me in that way. It was more like watching like a big crazy tragedy or something.
And I will generally agree with you. This, and I think, I will say, this show clearly hits me a little harder than it does you. I would still agree that I think the moments where Brotherhood or the manga cut deeper, because it's a bigger story, it's a finished work, it's a single author getting to tell a full story, like that alone. But also, as you say, this is dark in much more of a melodramatic sense, almost a Shakespearean tragedy, big, mythical kind of sense going on to it. It's not interpersonally dark in quite the same way. And that's down to some of the show's language is doing that. Like I don't mean like what they're saying, I mean like the filmmaking. Like the final 3 episodes happen in an auditorium with a big stage, right? Like that is a melodramatic way to frame the ending of your story. It is going into full alternate world stuff and evoking the rise of fascism in Europe. Like, there's all sorts of things that are, it's much bigger gestures. And I think some of it works very powerfully for me. I think some of it audio-visually is very well done, including, like, Scar's death and the killing of all the soldiers and all of that kind of stuff. Also, at that point, I was just like, yeah, let's kill some fucking soldiers. These guys are terrible. Scar earned that fucking revenge, I will say.
Yeah.
And I think this version of Scar is interesting. I like he winds up at the end with both of his arms blown off, and he's doing this to save Alphonse. Like, I think he has a pretty complete character arc in this version that I like. But I totally understand what you're saying. And, like, yeah, I mean, the manga is really interesting because it's never purely one thing. If it has more of a shonen battle thing in its second half, it's not Yu Yu Hakusho. It's not Dragon Ball. It's not to that degree, right? And it has, sort of the dark fantasy element, but it's not Berserk. Few things are Berserk. So it is kind of a mix of a lot of different genres and styles, and I think that generic and tonal variety means that when things hit, they hit hard. There's the one, and it's Romy Park's line delivery of the thing about, I hate you, you stupid dad at the end, which is really his way of saying he loves his dad, is one of the hardest hitting things I've ever seen, and that is a much, much smaller moment than anything you get in the final 9 here. Even if, in a lot of ways, these are, Brotherhood is much bigger because it's about this whole nation, and Father is, Fullmetal Alchemist proper is a we're going to kill God story, right?
Yes.
His father's goal, which is not what this show is. So it's weirdly bigger in some emotional ways in that it's more histrionic, and it's much smaller on a plot scale. And that's part of what, to me, qualitatively, whatever, I just think it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, it definitely is very different. And yeah, I generally like what they do, particularly with Scar here. Like, so much so that I think it kind of takes the wind out of the sails for me for the last, 5 or so episodes when Scar is dead. Because I think, his material is so compelling, and it's so central to, particularly, a lot of the stuff I liked in the second cour. Like, I just love all of his stuff early in the second cour with Dr. Marco and all that's so good. And even though it's fairly different from at this point, it's very different from the character from the manga. There's a purposefulness to that character and a clarity to how that character is used that, once he's gone and it's all just Ed and Al and the homunculi, it gets very kind of confused in how the plot is structured and what is happening. And so if I were to split, the kind of 2 halves of the last cour, the first one being Ishval, or Lior as a reflection of Ishval and Scar, and then the second half being central in the homunculi and them having to wrap everything up, I definitely like the Scar side of it more.
I do too, and I think that is the point where this show, I think, most convincingly is its own work of art, and part of that is it gets out of its own insularity. And this show's insularity is not fully its fault. It's because it's taking a small sliver of the manga, and we've said it over and over again, right? It only has so much cast and geography to work with without inventing a bunch of shit, which can go one of 2 ways. But I think when you're in that Scar stretch, Ed and Al are still big characters, and Al in particular, I think, has great material in that stretch in Lior. But because Scar is kind of the other protagonist there, kind of like he is in the manga, just in a very different way, it feels less insular. It feels like the story of a whole world. And also just, man, what a story. Scar dragging a fucking rock across the town of Lior until he builds a giant transmutation circle, and then luring in these military assholes and doing all of that. And then in his final moments, using that power to save the life of Alphonse Elric, this kid who he initially was an enemy of, who he has come to realize is some part of the best version of himself, and then he dies for it. It's just a really good story. It's just very well done.
Yeah, 100%. There is one thing that they do here, though, that I really don't like, and it connects to some of the stuff we've talked about with female characters. I really hate the implied rape of Rose and her having the baby from it and all that stuff. And then they continue to use that character in a way I find kind of gross with Dante, in that she's going to become a body for Dante. And it's the most purely objectified in the sense of that she's made into a literal object for the whole last 10 episodes of the show in a way I really did not like.
This is funny. Not Rose's rape. None of that is funny.
Yeah.
What's funny is that I think it's because the dub is not as forward with it. The dub is, I checked this at a couple of points. The dub, any mention of sex, that was still Funimation's line, and they would kind of shift, because there's also a line about, like, oh, this body will make love to you, Edward, in Japanese, about Rose. And in English, it was something like, oh, you'll get to be close to her again. It's much more, you wouldn't imply sex from it, unless, maybe if you're an adult you would, but like as a kid you definitely wouldn't. And the whole thing about what happened to Rose and her trauma is that she was clearly assaulted by these soldiers, and then a baby came out of that. That is very much obfuscated in the dub. So when I got there in Japanese this time, I was shocked, because that is not a plot point that I had in my head. And I do think it's in poor taste. If I feel like the show was equipped to actually give its female characters agency, it would be an honest reflection of war and some of the broader themes they're talking about. But Rose is not a character here, she's an object, and that's the problem.
Yeah, and it's like the show has not bought any goodwill on these kinds of themes by how it's treated its other female characters with Izumi and Winry over the rest of the show. So it's like, I'm already kind of... I mean, again, this like goes back to the shit they do with like the tomboy girl in episode 4, and it's just like, this is kind of gross and all that, and how they use Winry in episode 8. It's just like a running thing, and then to push it to that really extreme level of rape, and also in ways that like it doesn't even like the timeline of it doesn't even make any sense. Like, has 9+ months passed at this point that like this could even be a thing that physically happened is a thing that I think is legitimately confusing. Like, it's just, it feels shoved in there for, like, Ed to have a big reaction about it and to make it, like, dark in that very edgy way. And instead it's just, like, annoying. And it just is, like, you're just using this character you haven't invested anything in at all as, like, a token, and then keeping her as a token for the rest of the show. And you don't even have enough time to do anything with it at all. It's really frustrating, and it's, I think, a thing that, like, is the biggest letdown about this show across the whole board, is how it uses its female characters. And I really wasn't expecting like that to be the, like, you know, the shit cherry on top of the shit sundae or whatever, of how they're like using their female cast to be like implied rape right at the very end.
Yeah. And it is, and again, since you just read the manga, I think we would agree the manga is like pretty exceptional within its genre about female characters. It is unusually good at that, and it is too bad that the anime is unusually bad, we might say.
Yeah. I mean, here's like another point on the female character thing with like Winry. They build the whole thing where there's a running subplot at this point where Winry knows that Mustang killed her parents, and she doesn't know what to do about it or how to confront him about it. And then like a little bit after the section we're talking about, she yells it out in like the middle of a scene that has nothing else to do with it. Mustang hears it, and then he talks to Ed about it. He doesn't say a fucking word to Winry for the rest of the show. He doesn't say a word to Winry for, like, the whole show. Like, fuck you. Like, you can't even fucking apologize for murdering her goddamn parents, you war criminal piece of shit. Like, what the hell? Ed's the one who needs all of your sympathy because you murdered her parents? Like, fuck off. That's how little this show regards Winry as a person, that it didn't even occur to them that, like, that is not the appropriate way for this, like, subplot to resolve for these characters, is Winry doesn't get any closure on it. Because nobody, like, Ed doesn't say anything about it to her. Nobody says anything about it to her. She has, like, one scene in the show after that sequence.
This is why I'm so glad we're having this conversation, Sean, because I think these are some of the kinds of things that, like, I think I can look past my nostalgia. I don't think I have that problem, but I think just because this is a show I've known since I was a kid, some of these things are just... well, that's how it happened, so I don't think about it. And of course, you're coming to this fresh as an adult and having just read the manga. So I think it's good. That moment, I'm sure, would have stood out to me, too, in a lot of different... and I definitely remember it being weird, because I think all the stuff with Winry in the back half is bad. But, like, definitely I didn't have that strong a reaction to it, but it should have that strong a reaction, because you're right.
Yeah, it's like, it's so fucked up. Like, what? Like, why are you saying this to Ed? Like, turn around, she's standing right there, asshole. Like, some character growth you have.
Okay, so there's a couple components here. We have You made a second tweet about this show,
Yes.
which is that they do unlock fast travel, just like in Game of Thrones. And, you know, it makes sense because when you're playing a video game and once you've gotten to all the places on the map, you can fast travel there. And they've gotten to all the places on the map. So now Ed and Al can fast travel to Risenbull. They're a little bit on the outskirts of it, but they get there. And then they can fast travel up to Doubleth. And that is the weirdest one where Ed, I guess, goes out for an afternoon and goes to Doubleth and then comes back. My theory is that this is just a really small world. And everything is like 5-minute walk away, and it's very compressed.
Yeah. It's like, it's particularly confusing if you've come from the manga, because the manga is so clear about building that space, and it's like you're seeing maps of Amistris all the time, because it's built as a giant circle, right? Like, which is for a reason in plot stuff. There's like a good reason why in this world where everyone uses transmutation circles, Amistris is also a giant circle. But that means that, like, the geographic location of everything is very, very clear. And also trains are really important in this world. And it's like a common, like, motif is like everyone gets places by trains. It's steampunk. It's all that stuff. And that's true of the manga. It's also true, obviously, of the anime, because they're adapting all that stuff from the manga. So all of a sudden, it's like the two ones that really... I went like, what is even happening? Was them walking through the desert of Lior and somehow getting to fucking Risenbull, which is like on like Lior is like in the top northeastern section, and then Risenbull is like in the southeastern section. Like, it's like you're going so far by foot apparently to get there. Then they go halfway to, like, they get on a train to go to Doubleth, but they get kicked off like halfway through these. They get discovered. Somehow they get to Doubleth, and then, like, Ed and Izumi end up in Central without you ever seeing them, like, leave. Like, they just are in Central all of a sudden in a cut. They're, like, it cuts back to them, and they're, like, in one of the barracks or whatever, trying to go find where King Bradley is to beat him up. And you don't get any sense of how they traveled there, where they are, anything like that. They just try to hide it all with this, like, awkward cut. And it's, like... It broke my brain completely. I was so lost about what the fuck was happening, because this series, especially I guess if you're coming from the manga, like, it's so methodical in its world building and cultures and all that kind of stuff, and in the geography. So when all of a sudden you had a show that's respected that in its adaptation up to this point, and then it just chucks all that shit out the window, I was very disoriented for the last, like, 5 to 6 episodes of this show.
That is fair. That is totally fair. It's something that I definitely would not have recognized as a kid, because what kid is that invested in geography? But I definitely noticed it as an adult, in part because you had tweeted about it. But it is also just I guess in this version of the story, Lior is on the other side of those mountains next to Risenbull. That must be what it is. Or maybe, Sean, they're using alchemy. Ed claps his hands, hits the ground, and he bunches up all the earth. It's like warp in Star Trek. It just all gets compressed, and he walks over it, and then he claps his hands and puts it back to normal, and we just don't see it. It happens off screen.
I like the idea that all of the train rides they take are like 5 minutes long. It's like, and that's how lazy they are. It's just like, you just don't realize that, no, they're only on the train for like 5 minutes and then they get off. Yeah, it's like they could have absolutely, it's like a 30-minute walk to go down to Doubleth. Yeah.
It's basically like, it's all just the size of Tokyo, and it's like using the train instead of going like 2 stops by foot.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, actually, Tokyo would still be too big. Never mind. You know what I mean.
It's like Manhattan or something. It's like, do you use the subway or do you just want to take a walk?
So the final, like, act of the show is in Central with the city from Dark Souls that is buried under the... It feels like you used a Nier Automata reference. To me, it immediately felt like a piece of lore in Dark Souls or Elden Ring of there was a city and now it's buried, and you go under it and it very much looks like one of the lost cities in a Miyazaki game, but I see the Nier Automata reference too.
Yeah, I was thinking of the Nier Automata one because there was that whole thing with the like mod or whatever that... Like, there's some viral thing that happened recently. I was like, yeah, this does look like the weird underground city in Nier Automata also, which obviously could very well have just been influenced by this design. But yes, you have your weird underground city. There is an interesting line of dialogue where they reference the, like, eastern city that disappeared overnight, because there is a piece of setup very early in Fullmetal Alchemist. I think it's in the Show Tucker chapter where they hear about there's some, like, myths about the Philosopher's Stone, one of which is an Eastern city which disappeared in the middle of the night hundreds of years ago, which is a really critical piece of background lore for the main series, that they do have that line in this anime adaptation, and they reference it here, where they say, like, oh, this is a city, it's like the city in the East that disappeared overnight. There have been countless cities like this that Hohenheim in them, like, did this, like, transmutation to. And, like, that's, like, a really funny little piece of information, a little piece of dialogue that when they put it there, they had no idea how important that little foreshadowing was in the manga and how, like, central it was to, like, all the major plot shit that happens way later in the manga.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But yeah, so the final act of the story is learning about Dante and Hohenheim. Dante, who has a killer piece of theme music. I just have to say, Michiru Oshima, the music for Dante, which you first hear playing on like a phonograph at her house. I love that detail. And then it comes back here. My brother, I was talking to him, and he does not like this version of the show that much, but he was saying he thought the music for Dante did a better job telling the Dante story than the anime itself, and I think he has a point. It's a great piece of music. Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised how little Dante was in this, because I knew that because after I read the manga, I think we talked about this on the Weekly Stuff briefly, that, like, I looked up where the divergence points were and realized, oh, it diverges from the manga before you find out who the main villain is, so they have to create their own main villain, and so I had assumed that the Dante stuff would be something more, like, fulsomely represented much earlier in the show, but it's, like, right at the end that she comes in. Like, it's not until she takes over Lyra's body that she really becomes a character.
Yeah, I mean, it's, so you have, with the events of Greed, you have the old Dante, you don't know she's a villain yet. They imply very heavily she has taken over Lyra's body, but then you don't get back to Lyra for a while. And then it's really when Hohenheim comes in that you get the full info dump that Hohenheim and Dante are old as shit, and Hohenheim is an evil motherfucker just in the past of this show, because they killed a lot of people so they could create Philosopher's Stones and keep swapping bodies, but their bodies are disintegrating. That's why Hohenheim left Trisha, which I actually think is a cool little detail they built in. I think that's an interesting version of the story here. And then the homunculus are basically, her minions that she is using to get another Philosopher's Stone to just keep on living, and it's this sort of entropy story that comes from that. And that's the big threat at the end of the show. It's a much more, on one level, it is a much more personal version of this kind of story than Father trying to kill God. On the other hand, it is a little more melodramatic and histrionic, as you've said.
Yeah. And just, like, for context, everything you're explaining, that's all revealed in episode 45 of 51.
Okay.
So it's like, that's what I mean by, like, she is not really a villain for much of the show, actually. And that's kind of what I mean by I was surprised by it, because it's like, you only have about 6 episodes, really, for her to be an active presence, or about 7 if you count that episode. It's she's not really around for much, which is interesting to me.
Yeah. It's one of those things, I think there are things that don't fully work for me in this stretch, but overall, I do like this final stretch of episodes. I think the episode where where Lust dies because of wrath, and then Ed and Al kill Sloth, and then from there you go on. I think there's some dynamite stuff. I think that episode has some really good stuff. One of my favorite scenes in this, or any Fullmetal Alchemist work, is Ed and Mustang's final scene together in the car. On their way out, which I think is a beautiful scene. That's at the end of episode 49. 48, because then 49, 50, and 51 are the final ones. And I think some of the final confrontation is very striking. I think the move to this alternate universe thing, I know that bugs the shit out of some people. I like it. I think it's interesting. You have to very much detach from anything that is going on in the manga to enjoy it. But I do, and then the final episode, it's dark as shit with Ed lying impaled dead on the ground, and then Al sacrificing himself, and then Ed reciprocating the sacrifice. And there's some interesting stuff in that is technically kind of how the manga ends, in the sense that Al, if I'm remembering correctly, gives up his body to get Ed's arm back so Ed can defeat Father, and then Ed, using the Philosopher's Stone and his own alchemy knowledge, trades for Al's body and get Al back. That's a much more cheerful version of it, because the way it works in this version, the Al of the series effectively dies, and then Al from before the series is brought back, and then Ed is stranded in our world. But I don't know. I do like it. I think thematically it's there's some interesting stuff going on here. I think tonally and on a directorial level there's a lot of good material. It's always sort of left some lingering feelings in me over the years, in part because, again, this is one of the first, I feel like, big pieces of fiction I engaged with that really heavily like leans into the gray areas and unresolved tensions, and that the show does not have a purely happy ending and all that kind of stuff. And it was striking to me. And it's not as striking to me now, but a lot of it still works for me.
Yeah, for me, I think it's a thing where I like a lot of the ideas, but I think the execution of so much of it feels so rushed to me that, like, it doesn't really... I didn't really, like, get emotionally invested in it particularly. And then part of it is also, like, because it's a lot of this is also intercut with stuff that to me is just, like... like nothing of, you know, this is, we haven't talked about Terminator Archer, who
it's horrible. Yeah,
it's so bad. Somehow fucking Izumi can't just fuck this dude up. This is one of the things I hate about what they do with Izumi in this show. She's just really weak. Like, she gets beaten by greed where she would have easily been able to take out greed in the manga. She just is told not to by Al because they want to make a deal with greed. So she's like, fine, I'll leave. And somehow she's not able to just beat the shit out of this dumb robot man who really should have just died in the transmutation shit. And then all the stuff with Mustang here, like, I think I kind of see why you like the scene with him and Ed in the car, but to me, like, it's like too little too late. Like, I felt so alienated by it that I had no emotional investment in the relationship between those characters anymore, because there just kind of wasn't one. And so them talking, like, almost like it's that thing where sometimes it felt like they were talking almost like at the audience about the themes of the show, which I think happens a couple of times here in an almost Neon Genesis Evangelion or Metal Gear Solid-esque way, where it's like the dialogue is a little bit too pointed and doesn't really feel like things characters are saying, but things that a writer is saying to you. Like that happens with Dante with her screed about like Toka Kokan or the law of equivalent exchange and why it's like fake. And it's just like, okay, I get it. Like, you can't just stop talking at me for like 5 minutes on this scene with a weird spinning 360 shot that I don't think worked really well. Like, there's a lot of little finicky stuff like that where it feels like the show has to jam all this information and like ideas into this very like compressed and direct format because there's not enough room for all of this stuff to breathe. The spaces that do breathe, I think, are effective. And I think the last episode is quite good in a vacuum, even if, like, I think the execution up to that point meant I wasn't really fully invested in it. But, like, a lot of that stuff in Ed's death and how that resolves, you know, and I think the whole, like, kind of epilogue of the last episode is really good because it has, like, actual space to, like, breathe some life and vitality into those moments. So when it gives itself that space, it's great. But there's a lot of stuff in here that's so... moves so quickly, it just was hard for me to get invested in it.
No, and I totally understand what you're saying, and I think that's all fair. You know, it definitely, I do think the best part of this stretch is the last episode, and we should probably give some more attention to that in a minute. But yeah, what did you make of, you know, so I guess you had, one of my questions for you on this episode would have been, what was your reaction to the alternate universe that is our world thing? But it sounds like that you had known that for a while.
Yes.
What was your reaction to seeing how it is deployed here? Because the sort of series of events is that Hohenheim is sent there a few episodes earlier. In episode 49, at the end, Ed gets sent there, and that's the cliffhanger into episode 50. Ed dies twice in episode 50. He dies in the body of Ed in London, and then he dies at the end of the episode with Envy, and then we have the final episode. But I'm curious what you made of all of that stuff.
I think it's kind of dumb. Like, I don't know. I have, like, a hard time getting a sense of, like, what does that really add? It just feels like, you know, and obviously I'm coming at it from the perspective of having read the manga. So, like, to me, the gate of truth and all that stuff is, like, it's very philosophical and it's very introspective. And making it, like, it's literally a gate to another place. And all the, like needlessly complicated information about, like, oh, when we do alchemy, it's using the, like, energy of the dead people from this other world. It's just, like, I found it kind of, like, silly almost. Like, it felt like, especially because I already knew about the twist, it felt like it didn't have a shock value to me that I think if you don't know the twist, it might, like, the shock value might like be worth it in and of itself, but knowing that this was eventually going to be information, the World War I stuff is going to be revealed, then I actually saw it, like, I just didn't really see how it like made the story richer, other than it is the thing that allows the specific ending of Ed being in another dimension or whatever, like trapped in a different world. Like, it allows that mechanic to happen for the ending, and I think that ending moment in that beat, in that idea of the brothers being separated in that way, is effective. But all the like shit that has to go along with that, to me, is like unnecessarily complicated and doesn't really add much. And when you don't have a lot of space to start working with like the material you have at the end of the show, it feels like it's too much time spent on something that you really didn't need to spend that much time on.
Yeah, and some of this for me is I don't remember the specifics for me of like seeing this and then versus when I saw the movie, and the movie Conqueror of Shambhala, which we've split off to talking about next week, I think for good reason, since we're about to hit 3 hours here. You know, that one is not set in World War I London. It's advanced a couple years, and it's about the interwar period in Germany, which is where they are at the end of the show, I guess. Yeah. And so it's specifically about the rise of Nazism and fascism, which is a pretty clear parallel for what's going on in the show with Ishval and some of that stuff. And so I think that makes more sense once you've seen what the movie does with some of that. Again, in my memory, I make no promises about the actual quality of any of this because I haven't seen it in a long time. But like, yeah, I think in the moment it's an interesting twist. I think there's something just evocative about there being this other world that Ed is going to. It specifically being our world is always the thing that I think throws some people for a loop, and I understand why. The thing about, because I also was going to ask you what you felt about the whole detail, because I had completely forgotten this detail, that like deaths in our world fuel alchemy in the other world. That's one of those ones where I can see 100% the thematic idea, because the thematic idea of so many of these closing episodes is challenging the ideas of equivalent exchange and some of the things that are taken as truth that are then complicated in the closing episodes. And the idea that, no, your alchemy, it's not just a simple, like, the radio is broken and you put it back together. There's an energy there, and that comes from somewhere. I think that's an interesting idea. I think it's a too little too late moment to, like, fully explain that idea. And then I do think it also plays into the broader sort of trend in this show, sometimes which results in good stuff and sometimes which results in bad stuff, of it feeling like it has to give a plot explanation for things in the manga that are just things. Like, there's never an explanation in the manga for how alchemy is alchemy. It's just alchemy, you know? And the gate is just, as you say, it's a much more philosophical thing. There isn't a question, there isn't an answer to the question of what's on the other side of the gate, any more than there's an answer of what happens after we die, right? It's just a mystery. And this show just has a different valence on all of that, which it's different people writing it. It makes sense. It's not as unified a work because it's not one person writing a manga through to its end. So, yeah, and that's a messy set of thoughts, but that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, like, because for me, part of the thing is, like, you know, a major theme in the manga also is that, like, Toka Kokon is kind of bullshit. Like, it is a legitimate, and I'm constantly using the Japanese term because that's just what's stuck in my head. So it's like the law of equivalent exchange, Toka Kokon, right? And that is a thing that, like, is a legitimate physics principle when you're talking about legitimate physics scenarios in which it applies, but it is not a philosophical truth that governs philosophical things. And that's, like, I think something that when we talk about Brotherhood, we can get into, like, what is that series' approach, assuming that it is good at doing what the manga does, of, like, breaking down, like, why does the state want people to see the world through the perspective of Toka Kokon? Like, why is that useful for the state? And how, in what ways does, like, Ed and Al have to break through that mindset and see the broader, like, world and broader possibilities? And I just think the manga is much more sophisticated at how it's tackling that idea, whereas this show, it ends up in this, like, trying to get Toka Kokon on technicalities. It's like a Twitter, like, reply debate me kind of thing of Dante being like, well, obviously Toka Kokon can't be real because of this exception, this exception, this exception. It's like, that's not the point. Like, they know that it's not universally applicable in all things. Like, if you talk to Ed early in the manga about it, when he still believes in Toka Kokon in those ways, like, this wouldn't, like, make him not believe in it in the same way that, like, if you go up to someone who's, like, religious or like a Christian or something, and you try to explain how like, well, really, logically speaking, the universe couldn't have been made in blah blah blah, or like Adam and Eve couldn't have been the first. Like, they don't believe in that thing for like strictly logical reasons. That's not what it's about. It is a worldview and a mindset and a framework. And it's like, you pointing out technical logical inconsistencies in that philosophical framework is not interesting. It's dumb. And it's like the more wholesome work that the manga does in approaching Tokakokan as a concept, and how it is like dominates that world in ways that are like perverse, is much more interesting to me. And we'll obviously be able to get into that when we talk about that show. And it's where I think the fiddly detail of, well, technically the energy that needs to operate must come from the lives expended in this parallel universe. Like, I don't fucking care. I don't care. That's not the interesting part about it, because it doesn't actually tackle like the substantive element of what this series is doing with this concept.
No, and I think you're 100% correct about that. I find some of what this show is doing with it interesting, but that doesn't mean I think it's better than Brotherhood. I've seen the idea that, this show actually questions some of these ideas more, and I don't think that's true. I think they both question it. I think Brotherhood has its plot, and then it questions the philosophy around it, and I think that is ultimately the better approach. This one is questioning more the mechanics around it, which is always the less interesting way to do it, and I think that's true.
Yeah, and it's just Brotherhood doesn't, or slash, I should say, the manga, like, it doesn't have to narrate or exposit at you to deliver that story, and that's what this show is kind of reduced to, is that awkward, like, 360 spinning shot, like, from where the camera is looking out and spinning between Ed and Dante as she is ratcheting off all this shit about the law of equivalent exchange. And it's like, this is such a clumsy way to try to deliver this. Like, you need to have more confidence in your ability to weave this concept naturally through the events of your plot, instead of trying to have this character just sit here and, like, Metal Gear Solid style, explain it all to the audience.
Yeah. And, as we've said before, I think the Neon Genesis Evangelion, Metal Gear Solid, explain it to the audience thing sometimes works better for me. It does not work in the sense of, like, it's my favorite thing ever, but it works a little bit better for me sometimes than it does for you. Like, I like Metal Gear Solid 3. I think you and I have the exact same problems with Metal Gear Solid 2, but, whatever. So I think that explains some of it here.
Yeah.
You did say you liked the final episode a little bit more. Do you want to talk about that?
I just think it gives it a lot of space to breathe. Like, I feel like you can feel the emotions of what is happening here, particularly like it's all the stuff with like Ed and Al in the like epilogue. I think the idea of Al returning, but it's like his body, right, and like everything along with that, and he has like lost this experience in these adventures, and like Ed, although he is like trying to like sort of pursue it again, and then Ed being stuck in like this other dimension trying to live his life. Like, it's very evocative, and it has, I saw you tweeted it because it's just like such a great last shot of both of the brothers reaching out to the sky, one of them the metal prosthetic of Ed, and the other the flesh arm that Al has like earned, but like he has also had to sacrifice all these things to earn it. Like, it's a very like emotionally satisfying point to end on, even if I think the build up to it is very messy. I was very happy to see that they built themselves a solid like 6 to 8 minutes to just let that whole ending section breathe, and you get a little snapshot of where all the characters are at, rather than, I was like worried this was just gonna crash land right into the end the way a lot of anime does when it has to rush to that last episode. It feels like they paced out that last episode really well, even if maybe it meant that some of the episodes leading up to it are a little bit too crunched.
Yeah, and I think part of that being that I have lived with this ending for 15, nearly 20 years. I'm probably forgiving more things along the way, because I really do like this ending. I think it is, like, and this is part of why I wanted to separate out Conqueror of Shambhala into a separate episode, because that obviously is it's a direct sequel, and it is a ultimate series finale, and it goes in different directions. But I think even if the movie never existed, I think this is a really striking ending to the story. It is not a fully, like, it is not the ending you maybe thought you were going to get. It's a very wants versus needs kind of ending. But the idea of the brothers being separated, which is like the ultimate like thing that you don't want to have happen to them. It's the thing they don't want to have happen to them. But it happens because of their love for each other. And then they are on a journey again. I think that's really beautiful. And weirdly, that is also something that Arakawa kind of does in the end of her manga,
yes,
which is that they willingly go off in separate directions. It's a very different context because they are fully choosing all of these things. But you can see they're extrapolating similar ideas out of it. And I think it's a powerful ending. And I think that last moment of them extending the hands, there's a lot of imagery like that actually in this show. One of the images I love in the second opening, the Ready, Steady, Go Larkin Seal song, is at the end you have Ed reaching up and trying to like grab something, is the like last image in that theme song. And so that's an image they do a couple of times. And I just, it's always been an ending that has stuck with me. I remember, crying when I first saw it. Didn't cry this time, but I still find it, very moving. And I think you're absolutely right that there is some messiness along the way. Again, I think I kind of, having seen it before, read backwards some of the like interesting, unfulfilled promises and ideas that this ending is about, that kind of comes back and is there in all the material.
Yeah, for me, it's like, it feels like the right ending, that they had the right idea for the ending, and that they gave this episode the space to be the episode it needed to be, even if like not all the pieces to me like were set up to make this ending to me like have like the gut punch quality it has watching it for the context I have.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. I also the scenes where Al sacrifices himself through the Philosopher's Stone to save Ed, I think is a great scene. The music and Rie Kugumiya's voice acting and just, getting one over on Dante and everything. I think that's a very powerful scene. And then I've always loved the image of Ed with his, I just realized how that was going to sound, the image of Ed with his shirt off. The image of Ed at the end of the episode where he's making the big transmutation circle and he's drawn on his own body because this is how he's going to access the gate and get Al back. I've always found that to be a really striking image. I think Romy Park's performance there is great. The use of music throughout the episode is just fantastic and deeply moving. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really well done. And like across this whole show, it's got, we talked about earlier, like really great production values. But the last episode definitely has the thing that, you want your last episode to have, where it feels like they like planned it out well and they gave it a lot of time so that the animators could really work on it and like, get, and the director and everyone could really kind of put 110% into that last episode. And it's definitely true here.
You see a little bit, this is going to be a more pervasive thing in the movie because they follow up on this, but the color setting of how they show Ed in Germany at the end with these kind of like faded colors, I really love that. It's near monochromatic, but not quite, and I think that contrasted with the more colorful Amestris that we're in, there's some of that stuff that I think is really striking and well done too. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just generally it's a very well-directed show. There's so many good tracks on the soundtrack. The song Brothers, which is the one with the big Russian choir, is one of my favorite pieces of music in the history of TV. I don't know where they got the idea for the Russian choir, but it works like gangbusters, so there you go. It's very good.
More things should have Russian choirs. That is my hot take from Fullmetal Alchemist.
It's amazingly good. It's something that I definitely feel. The music in Brotherhood is also great. It's an Akira Senju score. It's absolutely excellent. But it doesn't have the song Brothers in it, and there's some part of me that will always associate that with Fullmetal Alchemist, and it's missing for me a little bit, because it is just so... It tells, like, the story of these brothers through music so beautifully, the way Thomas said about the other piece about Dante. It's true, it does.
Yeah. Although, I think if you're trying to be entirely faithful, really, there shouldn't be any music, because manga doesn't have music, so why should this anime? It's a change, and I can't really abide by it.
That is a hot take, because you are going to have to say that about every anime we watch for the entirety of this podcast, Sean.
Why is there color, and why do the images move? This is bullshit.
Manga adaptations should just be scans, panel by panel, presented with a reasonable amount of time for you to read it.
Exactly. That's what I want from my media, and I just, nothing provides it.
Well, there you go. I think, Sean, sadly, you are going to be very disappointed by Brotherhood. That is not what it does with the manga. It's a little more traditional in its adaptation choices. But what else is there to say about Fullmetal Alchemist 03? A definitely weird show that I think still has things to offer.
There were a couple of the songs we didn't talk about. We talked about Ready, Steady, Go by Larkin Seal. There's also Melissa by this. I love this band name so much. Porno Graffiti.
It's a great song.
Yeah.
Kimi no Kae. It's so good.
Yes. And it's this is the thing. So you have pornography, you have the Arc and Seal, and then you have for the fourth one, which tragically they cut a couple of episodes for its run because they wanted to make the split happen at a narrative point. But Rewrite by Asian Kung Fu Generation. Pornography, Lark and Seal, and Asian Kung Fu Generation are like three of the best J-rock bands of the late 90s and 2000s, which for me personally, particularly Asian Kung Fu Generation, which I think might be like straight up the best alt-rock band ever. So it's like Rewrite is from their second album, Salty, which I did not know that this was a Fullmetal Alchemist song. I just have always really liked Rewrite. And I love Asian Kung Fu Generation, and so it's like this is like so my shit for J-rock, like this exact period, because all these bands are also like they did Bleach openings, they did fucking Naruto openings, they're on Gundam shows and shit like that. Like it's all from this period, and it's like that's a Cool Joke, which did Undo, like the third one, like that the third core song I think is fine, but it's clearly like the weakest link there, and they're also the band that is not like anywhere near as prestigious as the other three. But like having one that is just like a decent opening and then three that are just like all-timers, like that's a really fucking great ratio for your opening themes.
It's amazing. Brotherhood will absolutely keep that up. It's got a bunch of great ones. But Rewrite and Ready Steady Go are near the top of the pile for any anime openings for me. I just love those songs. Asian Kung Fu Generation is great. I've been listening to these songs since I was a kid. Rewrite, I was so excited to get to Rewrite, Sean, that I'd forgotten it was only the final 10, and we kept getting into episodes where I would like, we're going to see Rewrite, and then it would be Undo again, and I'm like, Undo's fine, but where's Rewrite? It's so good. There's also something about the fourth core, which is the one that's completely different than the manga, having a theme song called Rewrite, that I think is very funny. I have no idea if that was intentional, but
definitely not. Definitely not.
Okay.
That was just like one of like the two big songs from that album. So like that was not made for the show.
But man, works as a theme song just phenomenally because the animation they set to it. I love the opening with the guitar lick, and it's that elevator coming down into the city. There's so much good stuff like that.
Asian Kung Fu Generation just should do every anime opening theme. Like every show should have an Asian Kung Fu Generation song. It's just they're all so good. It's just like it's fucking great.
And I kind of feel that way about Lark and Seal, who very luckily for me do the opening and ending theme for the movie, and they're both great. And you know how much I love their song for Gundam 00, Daybreak's Bell. I've heard a lot of theirs, they're great, and I love Ready, Steady, Go. That one, honestly, I love even more as an adult than I think I did as a kid. There's something about it that also just fits Fullmetal Alchemist so fucking well. In terms of the endings, the first ending is, what's it called?
Kesenai Tsumi.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think the best ending of these four is definitely the second one, Tobiota no Muko A. I like Motherland. I particularly like Motherland because of the animation of Winry hanging out with the dog. I think that dog who has an Automia leg is awesome and should have been in both versions of this show way more because it's a great dog, and I do like that ending. And then I skip I Will every time because I think it's a bad song and a boring animation.
Yeah, that one didn't do anything for me. Like Motherland, which is by a band called Crystal K, that's one where like that reminded me so much of the ending to Gundam Wing, which has Relina on like the safari, where it's that thing where it's like, God, this ending theme does this character better than the actual TV show.
Yes, it does.
Like,
it totally does.
It's just one of those weird things where it's like, oh man, we didn't really put any space for our TV show to actually have this female character be like a person, but man, we can make a really great music video with this character in it, and it's like, I would prefer if they worked her well into the actual show, but I'll at least take my really good Winry music video we get with her cool dog.
Yeah. And I don't think Undo is bad. I don't skip it when I listen to all the themes. Undo is fine. And I do like, it's fucking bizarre, the opening animation for Undo has Al ripping a snake in half and then Ed cutting one in half. What was that about? That's not in the show. I kept on waiting
for that to happen. Like, that whole there's a big crazy fight that they animate there that has some of the Chimera characters from the Greed stuff, but it's like, man, this is such a cool scene and nothing like this happens at all in this show.
It's also like Al, the whole thing with Al is he's a gentle giant. Like, he does some fighting in the manga, but he would never just rip a living creature in half and bathe in its blood the way he does in that opening. It's so weird.
Maybe he just fucking hates snakes, It's just like, fuck this thing.
Yeah, it's fine. It's like if Indiana Jones was in a suit of armor. He'd tear the snakes apart. Anyway, Fullmetal Alchemist. This is not the best version of Fullmetal Alchemist, But I will say, sometimes you go back to something you loved as a kid and you're like, why did I love this? I didn't have that reaction. I definitely see it as much more nuanced now, but there's still a lot of this show I really like.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I had a lot of issues with it, but it was always obvious to me, like, why this show was really beloved when it came out for its audience. Like, it's, like, a lot of it I've watched, I'm like, yeah, no, I can see why this was in, like, 2004, 2005. This was such a big hit with, like, 12 to, like, 16-year-old male demographic. Like, I think it is, like, so well tuned for that specific period, whereas I think when you watch it outside of that, a lot of those flaws are probably more apparent, particularly if you have like the full source material to use as a reference point. But yeah, like, it's a fascinating show. Like, it is a weird thing to like, it's a weird and fascinating experiment you can do to hold up these two stories together and to see, like, how do you take similar starting points and what can you extrapolate from those to try to build your own version of this very different story. It's as we said at the top of the conversation, it's probably the most successful version of something like this I have seen, where instead of it just being, a really throwaway filler arc in a much bigger show like a Naruto or One Piece or Bleach or some one of those, or it being the thing you get if you, like, watched Claymore or Soul Eater or stuff like that from around this period, where they had, like, here's 2 to 5 episodes at the end, and that's all the anime original stuff, and this just, like, we have to desperately craft an ending. This is not that. Like, it is such a more fulsome version of whatever it wants to be. I think it is very flawed. I don't love the show, but I think, like, it really sort of, like, puts its foot down and, like, puts its stamp on what it wants to say, and I really respect that.
Yeah. I'm curious what you will make of the movie. I'm curious what I will make of the movie going back to it. I will say, if nothing else, I do think it's a very interesting movie. At least in my memory. Again, no guarantees. I haven't seen it in a while. We will be talking about that next week on Japanimation Japanimation Stale. This is great, Sean.
I intentionally never offered that as one of the potential names for the podcast. I was like, do we really want to put the word stale in the name of a podcast? I don't think so. We're only the second episode, Jonathan. We can't be stale yet.
No, we're not stale, because next week we're talking about Fullmetal Alchemist, the Conqueror of Shambhala.
Yes, we are. A movie that, while I knew about the World War I twist, I know fucking nothing about this movie, so I'm very excited to see it.
Japanimation Station.